the welcome desk. And at the end of the day, please everyone outside promptly for the departmental photo. The cloud is pretty easy to access. I won't go through this. Hopefully everyone's got access to it. So first of all, I just want to spend a few minutes saying thanks to everyone who's got us here, particularly the patients that we participate in our studies and all the participants. There is a quote from William Osler there about the importance of patients for everything we do. And of course our partners, Oxford Health, NHS Foundation Trust, Oxford University Hospitals, NHS Foundation Trust, and Oxford Brookes University as members with the University of Oxford, and all our colleagues in the departments of the University of Oxford, who are all part of the Oxford Academic Health Science Centre that helps coordinate so much of what we do here in Oxford. And obviously funding from many sources over the years, but particularly want to thank those really major funders, the Wellcome Trust, as we see John Williams here, NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, and the Medical Research Council. So much of what we do is relied so heavily on really substantial funding from all those funders over the years. I mean, what we're going to be doing over the next couple of days, rather than looking at infrastructure or strategy too much, is focusing on research and educational outputs and impacts, particularly reviewing a little bit and celebrating some of the achievements over the last 50 years. But we've all been very keen on planning this to make sure that we're planning for the future. So we're not just sort of congratulating ourselves, although obviously there's a chance to celebrate what we've done, but really we are moving into what I think personally is an unparalleled opportunity to really make transformational change in global mental health research. There is now more funding available than I think most of us have ever seen in our professional lifetimes, and it's really a fantastic opportunity to work collaboratively to make major impact and improve global mental health. Planning group for this, and most of the sessions have been planned by Daniel Friedman, Sina Fazell, Catherine Harmer, and Kay Saunders, but there's also been the rest of the people on the slide have been fantastic in setting the meeting up. So you know where to go when things go both for the content of the day, but also for the other bits. But I always like to put a slide about Robert Burton at this point. As we approach the 400th anniversary of the publication of Anatomy of Melancholy, in some ways Oxford's first big impact in mental health and psychiatry, as Sir William again, who crops up again, the greatest medical treatise written by a layman. And I think that's important because, of course, Burton was probably, did suffer from mood disorder, but also was a member of the humanities faculty, demonstrating, I think, again, the richness of Oxford's contribution in this area. And we'll be doing a lot more about the anatomy of melancholy as we come up to the 400th anniversary in 2021, so that's just a couple of years ago. But at the same time, of course, the other great 17th century neurologist, Thomas Willis, was born in 1621 and describes social Willis, but also coined the name neurology, and probably, I think, in modernity was the first to properly locate the subject of our interest in the brain itself. Now, just about the origins of the department, and in a second I'm going to go, and we've got a small film we've made about the department. But this is just the letter that was written to the Board of the Faculty of Medicine in 1960, after a subcommittee had been appointed by the board, with notably Dennis Hill and Elliot Slater from the Maudsley and the Queen's Square, who reported to Sir George Pickering, at that time the Regis Professor of Medicine, that we believe a chair of psychiatry at Oxford would be a great stimulus to the subject in this country, and that we believe that success would depend on close collaboration and contact with basic science departments in the university, and that has always been the vision of what we've tried to do here. And I'm sure that in the future, continued and deeper, ever deeper engagement with both actually with basic science, but across the whole university, will be terribly important to our success and our ability to do the high clinical impact work that we see as so important. So let me just come out of here in a second. So I'm going to show you this, and then I'm then going to introduce Andre Tomlin, who many people will remember from his time when Andre and I set up the Centre for Evidence-Based Mental Health together back in the 1990s. So before that, though, this is an illustrative animation.
Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford celebrates its 50th anniversary. We show how it has developed over the years and where the team is heading now and in the future. The late Professor Michael Gelder founded the department in 1969 and led it until his retirement in 1996.
Way back in 1960, when George Pickering, the Regis Professor of Medicine, decided that the medical school ought to have a psychiatry department, they formed a committee. The committee decided that it should be a chair of psychiatry and that it should be a research chair with very little clinical responsibility. And it wasn't until the end of the 60s that George Pickering managed to get an endowment from the Handley Foundation for the chair that left them with the need to fund the rest of the department, the lecturers and so on.
Now in our 50th year, we can see more than ever the importance of having the capacity we need to exploit the exciting advances in neuroscience for the benefit of patients. Apart from teaching, the fundamental goal of our research active clinical department is to deliver advances in the prevention and care of medical disorders. To do this effectively requires the brightest scientists, the best scientific facilities, strong partnerships and collaborations with academia and industry and patient groups. Epidemiology and data science have always been a strength of the department. Research in Oxford led to UK legislation to restrict pack sizes of paracetamol, which has resulted in over 30% reduction in the number of deaths from paracetamol poisoning. Teams in the department have taken a lead in promoting systematic reviews on psychiatric treatment, which has led to reliable, evidence-based recommendations for health professionals and the treatments they offer their patients. Collaborations with other Oxford departments have led to important discoveries about how treatments work at a biological level and how they can be developed and improved, such as eating, depression, and anxiety disorders. This led to a series of highly effective cognitive behaviour therapies, now recommended as first-line treatments. Current innovations include the use of virtual reality to augment the effectiveness of psychological treatments. Oxford is a leading research centre on mindfulness-based cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, and the Oxford Mindfulness Centre was created in 2008. Oxford University is ranked as the world's best institution for medical and health teaching and research in the Times Higher Education World University Rankings for 8 consecutive years. We were rated first overall for research quality in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience in the last Research Excellence Framework. A strong relationship with the NHS and track record of translational research led to a successful application for a mental health and dementia-specific NIHR Oxford Health Biomedical Research Centre, Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, and the University of Oxford Department of Psychiatry are working on proposals to develop the Warnford site as a centre for translational neuroscience, with new research and clinical facilities. As we approach the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Warnford Hospital and the 400th anniversary of the publication of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, the shared aspiration is to create a unique campus on the Warnford site, integrated with the rest of the Headington Clinical Academic Campus and with strong links to the local community. To support the development of new treatments for mental disorders and dementia, a dedicated clinical trials unit and clinical research facility were established. The Oxford Centre for Human Brain Activity is an internationally leading imaging facility, supporting translational and clinical research and part of the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging. Another innovation is True Colours, a self-management system allowing a person to record and monitor their feelings and symptoms using text, email and the internet. This approach has the potential to empower informed decision-making by patients, their families and care team. 2019 and beyond is an exciting time for mental health research, with global awareness and commitment to improvements in treatment and access. A strong public voice and opinion will help demonstrate that quality science, and its impact has never been more in demand. Help us translate these advances in scientific research into better mental health for all.
Thanks very much to Kate Rees for organising the creation of that. There was also, I think, very good to see Michael Gelder there, as of course we lost Michael last year. He would have been very excited to have been here today, but nonetheless, I feel that he was present with us from that film. So I'll just go on and introduce Andre Tomlin, who, come up, Andre, if you will. Andre was a member of the department for several years, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, before, and we set up the Centre for Evidence-Based Mental Health together, and then span out innovation, where he still works as the Chief Executive Officer. He's here today as the lead of the mental health, the mental health service, and he's going to tell us a bit about the how we are recovering today's and tomorrow's events by using social media and live streaming. So, Andre, thank you. See you back.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Everybody hear me all right? Back? Yeah? Great. I have some slides. Hang on a second. Where are they? Whoa, look at all those slides. Okay, am I in there somewhere?
Andre, wrong computer.
Oh, okay. Thank you. This has got
Doesn't
some
help,
files in
does it?
there.
Andre, what do you want? Do you want the Windows machine?
I just want my files, which are on these computers.
They're not on that computer.
Any IT people give me a help? Okay, so I should say in advance, if anybody's allergic to pictures of small woodland creatures or really bad puns, you may want to look away for the next 10 minutes or so. It's a real pleasure to be here. As John says, I started working in the department in 1999, so almost 20 years ago to the day. And I worked with John for 3 years in the Centre for Evidence-Based Mental Health. And it was a thankless task. This was kind of pre-NICE, evidence-based healthcare. I was just getting settled in Oxford, and we went around the country with a massive data projector that I had to carry. John never carried. We went to Carlisle and Exeter and everywhere in between, and we spoke to rooms full of psychiatrists about the Cochrane Library and literature searching and critical appraisal, and they really hated it. We were kind of heretics telling psychiatrists what to do, suggesting that they might want to read research. And gradually over the 3 years that I was at Oxford, we started to get some smiles and we started to get some traction, and we sort of got really excited when people started developing evidence-based resources. I'm here today with my colleague Mark Brown, Mark1in4 from Twitter, and we're doing live tweeting, podcast interviews, live streaming of this event. We're trying to reach as many people with this event as possible and get people online involved in the conversations that happen at this event. Professionals, policymakers, patients, carers. So I'm going to talk really briefly about what I do, which is write blogs about the latest reliable research and provide a platform for other people to do that as well. So why should we bother with all this digital stuff? Obviously this is your choice. A lot of you are not on Twitter for very good reasons. And I'm not going to try and persuade people to get onto Twitter because it's an amazing thing. Because it is an amazing thing, but it's also a terrible thing. So obviously it's your choice whether you decide to kind of ignore that or just lurk and consume it or actually participate actively. But I use it to disseminate evidence and to get people involved in democratic discussion about evidence. And for me, social media is amazing because it allows me to have lots of different types of people talking about research. We have about 300 people who write blogs for the mental health, a real range of people, patients, students, healthcare professionals, researchers, all kinds of different people. And they write for different reasons, but I think they're all kind of tuned into the ethos of wanting to disseminate stuff in a public forum. And many of them are involved on social media as well, and so when they write a blog about new research, they never write about their own research, they write about somebody else's research, there's some critical distance. They then get involved in the conversations on social media that happens. And sometimes that's the researcher getting back and saying, oh, thanks a lot for blogging about my work. I've got some questions about your highlighting the limitations in my work. Or sometimes it's patients saying, that's really interesting that you say that this treatment doesn't work as well as we thought it did, because that's my experience too. So our blogs are all evidence-based summaries of the research. They're all about 5 minutes long. They all have a very similar structure. They talk about the research, and they have a kind of critical friend perspective. So they talk about strengths and limitations, they talk about the implications, and they hopefully start some conversations. What are you going to do now that you've read this blog? Is this going to implement, is this going to change your practice in any way? So social media is useful for disseminating, but it's also really useful for doing research. And this is something that I think we're only just beginning to get a handle on. I'm working with the GLAD study, which is the new genetics, anxiety and depression study at King's. They're looking to recruit 40,000 people. At some point this year, they're about a third of the way into that right now. And we're using blogs and podcasts and social media to recruit, and particularly to target conventionally hard to reach groups of people, young men, people from non-white ethnic backgrounds, and people that don't get involved in research very much. I think there's an amazing opportunity for researchers to use digital technology. And so if you're thinking about doing that, do have a chat with me, because I've got lots of ideas and experience of how we could work together. And finally, what we're doing today is lots of digital stuff. We had to have this pun. I started the mental health 8 years ago, and then we started the learning disabilities health, and then we started the social care health. They're not very good puns. We thought the National Health Service was a really good pun. I present this sometimes and people have no response at all to it. So I have to do the kind of Ray Winston. But the reason that the National Health Service is a kind of interesting organisation to work with universities and charities is that we can teach you how to do this digital stuff. We can develop content that matches your content, so we can work with you to produce blogs that are in your areas of interest. And we're starting to do that now with charities, with university research departments, with NIHR. And we can also allow people that use the system to track their learning. We use gamification so that people can register on the website, they become an elf, and everything they do is then linked to their account. And that is something that we can start to link to educational programs. So we're piloting this at King's at the moment, where we have a proportion of the overall mark for a master's course which comes from people using the National Health Service and writing blogs and doing social media. So we can kind of embed these activities within an educational programme. So very quickly, finally, I'm just going to say something about what we're doing here today. Myself and Mark run this thing called Beyond the Room, going to conferences and trying to get a broad range of people involved in the conversations. We're doing that here today. Please do tweet if you're here. I know about half of you are on Twitter. I've done my research. Most of you will have a little look but won't send a tweet. Please do send some tweets today if you're in this room. It will really help us reach a much bigger audience with this conversation. And quick tips. Don't just say, oh, look, Professor so-and-so's on the stage talking about this, isn't it brilliant? Say something challenging, say something critical, say what you think. Link to some relevant evidence if you disagree. Bring other people into the conversation. It might be that there's other academics that you know who really disagree with this person. Ask them what they think of this slide. Don't forget the hashtag. And there's a drinks reception tonight, so please do put your phones away after the second glass of wine. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andre. I'm sure I carried it on time, actually.
No.
I'm going to hand over to Professor Dan Freeman, who's going to chair the next session.
Good morning. There's a very simple and important fact about the speakers you're going to hear from in this section. The treatments that they've developed in the psychiatry department have helped millions of people worldwide. Clearly, there's still more work to be done. Treatments can be made better, they can reach a greater number of people. And these are not clinical academics who rest on their laurels. You'll hear that in their talks today. But the crux, the essential point, is that millions of people have been helped. One marker of this is if you look in the NICE recommended treatments, over half a dozen treatments have come out from this department. That is extraordinary.
Okay. The influence has also been occurred through major figures in psychological treatment development, having sabbaticals here from Beck, Jack Crackman, David Barlow, Lars Goran Voss, have all been there for sabbaticals. And so and 30 years ago, in Oxford, hosted the first World Congress of Cognitive Therapy. So the influence of psychological research has been enormous, both nationally and internationally. But what we particularly want to do in this section today is honour this man, Chris Fairbairn. He's completed a 36-year programme of research on the understanding and treatment of eating disorders, the culmination of which is that NICE strongly endorsed his transdiagnostic treatment for all forms of eating disorders. He's not stopped. He's working on global dissemination of psychological interventions, but I think today's the perfect moment to pause to reflect on his
enormous achievements. This is the words of Steve Holland. Chris Fairbairn owns eating disorders. No one else has done more to understand their nature. They all rest on the same causal process or to treat. He can do in 12 weeks what psychoanalytic psychotherapy can do in 2 years. And he can do it using someone else's therapist at someone else's site. Courage, confidence, and compassion. The absolute best of the best. We will not see his like again. And Ross Shackman said, Chris has achieved much of his extraordinarily distinguished career, but I know that he's most proud of having made a difference to people with eating disorders. The publications, grants, accolades, and appropriate recognition of Chris's unparalleled contribution to the field, and his work will continue to transform lives for decades to come. And his former MSc student Vikram Patel said, I recall Chris's mentorship as being complex and crisp at the start of my career, maturing over the years into a smooth and mellow character. He taught me pretty much everything I need to know about psychotherapy research, which I put to practice in my clinical work. Complex and crisp and smooth and mellow. His influence has been profound as a treatment developer, as a mentor, and as an advocate for psychological therapies. Chris joined the department in 1981. Michael Gold had already brought in, before that, John Teasdale, Michael Matthews, Derek Johnson, and other people. So Chris joined in 1981. And then 2 years later, the department appointed its first tenured lecturer in clinical psychology. And that person is going to be our next speaker, David Cock.
Very well, thank you, Daniel. It's been an extraordinary 40 or 50 years. I'm going to really talk about what started the department. So Michael Gelder's first ever grant was from the MRC, establishing a psychological treatment group, particularly focusing on agoraphobia, with Henry Matthews, John Teasdale, and Derek Johnson. And the sort of top row of photos are the extraordinary cohort of people who started all the psychological treatment work in the department and achieved so much. The sort of middle phase of the department really started with Chris Fairbairn coming from Oxford as a welcome senior and subsequently principal fellow and assembling an extraordinary eating disorders team that you've heard about and will hear more about. And then the sort of rabble in the next line along, Saul Sarkoskis and I developed sort of anxiety disorders group, greatly aided by the other people in the middle row. But of course life moves on and we go into the 21st century and we have a new cohort of extraordinary people who extended the work beyond CBT. Mark Williams bringing in mindfulness, of course with William Kuiken, Daniel Freeman taking us into psychosis and many other areas, and of course our most recent appointment, Cathy Cresswell, is going to really help us work with children and young people to really help the next generation, which is the only generation that ever matters. So this is wonderful. I'm going to talk a little bit about how psychological treatments are developed, because that's been one of the main goals of the department. They're developed in different ways, but our group has had a particular strategy that's worked out well. It involves trying to identify the key psychological processes involved in maintaining different anxiety disorders, so looking at people's beliefs, their attention, their memory, and the way those all change their behaviour through experimental studies, prospective studies, and mediation studies. And then trying to develop novel treatments, which are very single-minded, trying to hit the maintenance processes in the models. The outcomes have worked well, so if we look at the different models, they're all highly influential. They're currently cited between 3,500 and 5,000 times each. And the treatments that have been developed have shown themselves to be superior to other equally credible alternative treatments, both psychological and medication. And so for social anxiety disorder, PTSD, and panic disorder, the treatments are the leading NICE recommended interventions, as Daniel said. And just to put an idea of how powerful interventions are in mental health compared to in physical health, the number numbers needed to treat for these interventions are 2. If you look at statins, the numbers needed to treat are about 130. So pathetic compared to psychological interventions. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the experimental work, the laboratory stuff that drives the rest. Just one study, I'll talk about social anxiety, I'm going to be able to talk about PTSD in a moment. So one of the things we noticed early on was that people with social anxiety who have very distorted beliefs about what other people think of them, part of the reason for that seemed to be to do with the type of image they have, very distorted, observant perspective images in which they see themselves from outside, but not the way you and I see them, but much more negatively. So in this experiment, we tested out whether those images have a causal role by getting people to have a conversation with a stranger while holding in mind their normal negative image or a more realistic image. And what you see is, firstly, that the negative image makes them feel more anxious. It also makes them think they perform less well. And there's a distortion there. The other person rates them as much more positive than they are. But something rather magical has happened. The image has leaked. And so the other person actually rates them less positively, and is less likely to want to talk to them again if they're holding a negative image in mind. How is that done? Well, the clue here is the safety behaviors concept that Paul Sarkowski has developed, and we'll talk about more. But the image are triggering a change in behavior, which then influences the other person. And I think this is just a nice experiment that shows how all these different maintenance processes are tightly interlocked. And the art of therapy is to break that interlock and start to change the processes. In social anxiety, we developed a very novel treatment to do that, but the images we use a particular form of video feedback to correct them. There are many other procedures. It is now being compared in 8 randomized controlled trials with all the leading alternatives. It has always beaten whatever it's put up against. So it's superior to exposure therapy in earlier forms, CBT, group CBT, interpersonal psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy, and SSRIs. So very positive news, but totally pointless. Why is it pointless? Because most people don't benefit from these advances in psychological research. For most of my lifetime, only a small number of people ever get the treatments. So the originators get lots of prizes and awards for doing the research, but the public doesn't benefit. There are 2 big ways to change that. One that Chris and Uncle will talk about is online treatment. But another is to try and change the whole landscape of mental health and change the way our mental health provision is done. And I'd like to finish off talking about that, and particularly what we call the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, or IAC program. This was created to try and deal with a gross injustice. There are 32 surveys that ask the public what would they like, psychological treatment or medication. Some people say medication, but in a 3-to-1 preference, they say psychological treatment. There is no country anywhere in the world where psychological treatments are more widely available than medication. And in the UK, for anxiety and depression, until recently, only 5% of people got an evidence-based psychological treatment. So the IAC program tried to change that. It was a lobbying program initially, a coalition between economists led by Richard Layard and clinical academics, which I led. And we used a set of arguments, which I won't take you through in detail, but if you're interested in them, you find them in our book, Thrive, The Power of Psychological Therapies. They were originally presented to Gordon Brown, who accepted them and started the IAC program. The coalition accepted them again and doubled the size of the program, and this administration has accepted them twice, once under David Cameron, once under Theresa May, and has doubled it each time. So what is the program? Well, it's a national plan which currently has been renewed up to 2024. It aims to train an extra 16,000 psychological therapists and deploy them in novel step care services which deliver nice recommended treatments. So not just CBT, whatever's recommended by us. There's a national training curriculum to ensure that therapists are trained to deliver them adequately, because psychological treatments are difficult to deliver. Unless you have properly trained therapists, closely supervised, you're essentially delivering a placebo, and you won't get the outcomes that the research promises. And When the initiative was announced by Alan Johnson, he did something very unusual in mental health. He didn't say, we'll see more people and they'll wait less time, which is normally what people do. He said those things, but he also said, and 50% of them will recover. As I told him, he should be able to do that. As it turns out, it was rather tricky to get to that point. It took us a long time, but we thought the trials should suggest you should do that. So where is it so far? Well, it's just celebrated its 10th anniversary, and we think it's a job in progress. Much more needs to be done, but it is, I think, starting to transform the treatment of anxiety and depression. We have these new IAP services in every area of the country now. They're seeing just over 1 million people a year. Not everyone needs a course of treatment. Some people have an assessment and advice, but about 560,000 people have a course of treatment each year. And we manage, using a session-by-session outcome monitoring, to have a data revolution. 99% of that 560,000 people who were treated last year have measures of their clinical outcomes. And that information is published on public websites, so all people in the community can see how the service is doing. That's quite a big change from pre-IAP days, where a national audit of psychological therapy showed we only got data on less than 40% of people. Waiting times have reduced a lot. It used to be up to a year to have a course of CBT. Now the waiting time is 20 days. And the targets have been more or less achieved, so 7 in every 10 people show reliable improvement in their symptoms, and in 5 out of 10, 55% at the moment, the improvement is so much that coded as recovered, or that's a rather arbitrary criterion. But whenever you measure anything in health, you find regional variability. And of course, if you get outcome data, you can observe that in mental health, just as you do in cardiology and oncology. And that was a lot of that in the IAP system. But people have learned a lot from that. And that has really helped them achieve the good outcomes and get out. So this slide here shows the national target of a recovery rate 50%. And you can see in the first year we're about 40%. And it's taken quite a few years to get to where we are now, which is 50% and going upwards. And we've been there every month for the last 24 months. But the reason for that is people learning from analysis of the data and variation in practice. All of that learning is now published in a manual from NHS England, so you can read it to see what people have learned. This is a paper in The Lancet using publicly available data to analyse variation in outcomes. I won't take you through all of the findings, but I'll mention one, just like with medication, there's a dose-response effect. Those services that have higher average numbers of sessions get overall better outcomes, and we still need to drive the system towards that. Another effect is social deprivation. Those people who live in a more socially deprived area have poorer overall outcomes. But our analysis suggests the reason for that is that in a socially deprived area, you're also less well funded for your mental health services, and so you have less quality mental health in IAP service. And if you correct for the quality of the IAP service, you more or less abolish the social deprivation effect. And here's a cutesy illustration of this. So we have 2 areas in the country next to each other, Windsor, the Queen's Weekend Cottage spot, and Ascot and Maidenhead, the Prime Minister's constituency. This is not socially deprived. It's at the 4th percentile for social deprivation in the country. Next door, in Slough, we have one of the most socially deprived areas in the south of England, at the 68th percentile. But the 2 are both served by a single, very high-quality IAP service. And as you can see, they both give outcomes above the national average. And if the Queen felt she would like to access one of the services, if anything would really get the chauffeur to drive you to Slough, because you see the outcomes are slightly better. So the government has been very pleased with the outcomes achieved by this programme, and has very reassuringly committed in the NHS long-term plan to a big expansion to move from, say, about 1 million people a year now to nearly 2 million, 1.9 million by 2024. And I think I'd like to just wind up there, but just to say that the IAP programme, which is an English programme, is having a broader effect on the sort of mental health landscape. The journal Nature describes it as world-beating in an editorial. The New York Times has a recent very favourable large op-ed, piece of it, and the Canadian Globe and Mail, looking at reforming its mental health system, recently had a simple headline: "For better mental health care in Canada, look to Britain." Norway has already developed 40 IAPT services showing similar outcomes to our own. Sweden has a smaller number. Israel 2 weeks ago announced the national pilot for IAPT, and Australia has quite a number of them, and a particularly socially deprived area of Los Angeles has just opened its first IAPT service. So thank you very much.
We have a chance for questions, discussions, just before lunch. Our next speaker is joined the department in 1993. The need to bring this brilliant professor over from Germany was one of the key arguments for getting the Wellcome Building percent.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to reflect on all the years of working on this department and also working alongside Chris, David and I and Paul were generously awarded the Wellcome Building by the Wellcome Trust, and we spent many hours enjoying planning it and also choosing David had a picture up there, so very nice to reflect on those days. My main area is post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think this disorder highlights one of the necessity for evidence-based treatment that was highlighted as one of the big main missions of this department. And I would like to illustrate that with one of the first studies I did when I was here in Oxford. Richard Mayo and my colleagues generously invited me to help them analyze data for their 3-year follow-up of a study of psychological debriefing that they had conducted, where people who had had a road traffic accident were offered, while they were still within 24 hours in the immediate recovery period from this traumatic event, a very commonly used intervention called debriefing, which basically asks people to recount in detail their trauma and talk about the emotions they had at the time. And in those days, it was considered to be a good practice to offer this intervention, and had the idea you could prevent people from suffering from the long-term effects of traumatic events if you got in early and helped them talk about their experience. And the follow-up showed that, as you can see in the slide, there was some improvement with this intervention. People who had high symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder at a 24-hour time point. Over the 3 years, they showed some recovery, and you could say that looks like a quite good result. But then you have to know that many studies have shown that people are very resilient and people recover on their own as well. So there's quite a lot of natural recovery, shown here in a slide from a large epidemiological studies from the States, from Kessler, showing that people who had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder immediately after the trauma, if you look in the long term, actually more than half will recover on their own. So some of the improvement we just saw on the last slide could be due to natural recovery. And this seems to be the case, because if you then look at the blue line here, this was a group that also had high symptoms initially, but then didn't get the debriefing. They were left to just recover on their own, and you can actually see they recovered more. So the well-meant psychological intervention that was being delivered to many people in many parts of the world actually in our study impeded natural recovery. So looking for evidence-based treatment in post-traumatic stress disorder seemed very important goal. The next study we did looked at another commonly used intervention, which is self-help. People were handed information booklets about PTSD and what to do, given advice such as face up to reminders of the trauma, don't avoid, talk about it. and so on. And in this trial, again we did in collaboration with Richard Mayu, we found that if we allocated people randomly to waiting or a self-help booklet that was written by Claudia Herbert, an expert in trauma-focused CBT, we didn't actually find a difference. However, we also had a face-to-face psychological therapy over several sessions, and that showed much better effects. And this is a treatment that we developed here in Oxford together with Anne Hackman, Frida McManus, and Melanie Fennell, and we call cognitive therapy for PTSD. I will talk a little bit about that later. But I wanted to show you that not only here in Oxford, but worldwide, through the dedication to evidence-based practice, we have observed an improvement in our ability to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. This is just a slide plotting the effect sizes of trials that have been published over the years from about 89. This stops here at 2009, so it's not quite up to date, but it shows the trend that compared to the field's very early efforts to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, if you look at just a Google impression, there is a trend, and it is significant, that the treatments have got better. We are better at treating this disorder. So how did we get there? One argument I would like to make here is that we have got better at targeting our interventions to the core symptoms of PTSD. And I take here the example of re-experiencing symptoms. These are the typical symptoms for this disorder, where people re-experience part of the trauma in a very vivid way, usually as kind of very brief sensory impressions, mainly visual, but it can also be auditory or even taste or smells, from brief moments of the trauma flashback into their mind. They also experience at the time very strong emotions that take them right back to the trauma, so they can actually re-experience the fear of dying at that very moment, many years after the trauma. And with that comes behavioral and physiological responses they showed at the time. And interestingly, during these experiencing symptoms, people have very limited awareness that they actually experience a memory. It seems to be happening again now. And that can have the extreme of dissociative flashbacks where people lose all awareness of a current environment to brief moments where they just feel they are back in the trauma. And one example here of how we targeted intervention is looking at the triggers of re-experiencing. What is interesting about them is that often there is no meaningful relationship between the trigger and the trauma, and the association seems to be mainly temporal. So let's say people were assaulted and the assailant had a sweater of a certain color, like a blue color. So in the aftermath of the trauma, patients might then just respond to anything that has this color, even if it hasn't had anything to do with the trauma. So it's often like a sensory overlap that between what happened at the time and what is around them in the current situation. And it's often only like one particular thing, like a color or a pitch of tone or something like that. And from experimental psychology, there's two basic learning processes that we think might be involved. One is perceptual priming, which you could say is the kind of perceptual fine-tuning. So the perceptual threshold, we know from experimental psychology, of anything you're exposed to, the perceptual threshold of recognizing this stimulus again, even if it's shown in a somewhat degraded way, or you hear it in a degraded way, you can have an advantage of identifying it. So that might play a role in trauma. Maybe there's enhanced priming for those kinds of stimuli that are around in the type of trauma, so that you can spot them easier later on. But there's also another important mechanism, is generalization of learning. You get people during trauma develop a kind of learned fear response to these reminders, and that then can generalize to things that are quite similar, and then more and more dissimilar with time. And both of these basic learning mechanisms would result in a poor discrimination between what happened at the time and what's happening now. So the person who was assaulted by the person in the blue sweater may now in the aftermath respond to any person that looks vaguely similar or the color blue in a different context with the same intrusively experiencing symptoms. And we've tried to bring these phenomena to the lab. One example here is a study where we showed blurred pictures of, I don't know whether you can see what it is. This is kind of a reminder of a trauma reminder for people before traffic accidents. So blurred pictures of trauma-related objects, general threat pictures, and then neutral pictures. And just asked people to identify what they saw on these slides. And what we found in this study, comparing people who had post-traumatic stress disorder, either after an assault or a road traffic accident, and those who had the same type of trauma but didn't have PTSD, is that we found that people in red with PTSD were much better in identifying the blurred objects that were trauma-related, so car-related pictures for RTA survivors and assault-related pictures for assault survivors, but not for general threat pictures, so that was a specific effect. And actually for neutral, interestingly, for neutral pictures was the other way around. So people with PTSD, you can imagine that perceptual system is fine-tuned to really spotting things in the environment that are similar in some way to the trauma, but they're actually less likely to identify things that reflect the normal reality around them. So what did we conclude about that for therapy? We thought really capitalize on this observation of the poor discrimination between the then versus now, between the trauma situation and the good situation at the moment, and really train people to, first of all, identify their idiosyncratic triggers, and that's really detective work, because patients don't come to us saying, oh, I have this list of triggers and I have to work on them. We have to find out first what these subtle sensory reminders are, and then we teach them a kind of technique that we call then versus now discrimination, where they really, as soon as they confront a trigger, they have intrusive memories, look around them, see what is the trigger, but how is the trigger in the current situation now different, and how is the context different. And this takes some practice, but patients find that very helpful in really overcoming these reappearing symptoms in PTSD. So this is one example of the treatment techniques that are derived from the theory and also the lab-based studies and also prospective studies of this condition. And with techniques like this and other specific techniques that we developed for post-traumatic stress disorder, we find the pattern of results that David mentioned, that post-traumatic stress disorder treatment with cognitive therapy for PTSD program works better than, and this is in here, the red line, weekly treatment. It works better than the green line, which is supportive therapy, and also better than waitlist. And there's also an orange line here in terms of looking at patient choice. We were interested in whether the treatment could be condensed to 1 week. So we had an intensive treatment phase as well, where people, intensive treatment group, where people got the main treatment over a week. And you see the orange line shows a faster improvement, but overall the same outcome as the weekly treatment. So it can be delivered in various forms, and that leads me to the last point. Can we also make the treatment more efficient in terms of therapist time, in terms of the goal of bringing the treatment to more people? We have completed a trial showing that we can reduce the treatment time needed for a therapist, not for the patient. They need to put in the same number of hours, but 50% of the therapist time by giving patients self-study modules where they learn some of the basic messages that we want to give them in treatment, also some of the basic techniques, and that seems to work as well as the standard treatment. And our latest mission is to see whether we can really bring the treatments online so that we can deliver them also again more efficiently, but also bring them to more people. People have trouble accessing treatment services for various reasons. And we've delivered an internet delivered version of the treatment where all the treatment techniques are realized online, but people have still support from a therapist through weekly phone calls and also messages. And just one example here, because we talked about the then versus now discrimination technique. So in the program that would look like this, they have a module that they work through to discover their triggers and then also learn about the idea of the then versus now technique. And then they can practice it in a special page in the program where they can upload media, so they can upload pictures, let's say they have a car accident or sounds when they have found that the sound of brakes screeching takes them right back to that trauma as a memory trigger, and they can upload this sound file and then play it back to them while at the same time practicing the technique of realizing, oh, they are just at home, sitting safely, not in a car, they can move about, and they can listen to the sound without really any danger. And there's also reminders of the here and now on the side. They can upload reminders to themselves as a picture of their therapist, but they can upload, let's say, a picture of themselves with their children now at an unhappy occasion after the trauma, showing they have survived and they still live with their children. We are in the midst of doing a randomized controlled trial of this internet-delivered version of the treatment that's part of the Oxford Health BRC psychological therapy thing that John already mentioned. We had successfully completed a pilot study where we found that the treatment was very promising, but we'll have to obviously await the results of the trial to see how well it will do under randomized control conditions. Thank you very much.
So, Paul Psychoticus joined the department in 1985 and has led on work on OCD and health anxiety. He's also the most recent returnee, and we're delighted to have him.
Okay, well, it's great to be back. It's amazing how many people are still here. I was sitting next to somebody who will remain nameless, and said, "Would you know everybody here?" I said, "No, I don't know the gentleman sitting on my left." And the gentleman sitting on my left was Paul Harrison, I knew very well. You are a bit older, Paul. Anyway, it's lovely to be back. I'm going to be talking about, well, we'll be talking about stuff in general, to be honest. Two disorders in the general way is a bit much to get in 10 minutes. There are more psychiatrists who changed the world, but there were two psychiatrists in my life who argue as having changed the world, and these are they. I'm not going to say any more about Michael Gelder other than my extreme gratitude, really, for the welcome that he and other colleagues gave when I joined this department in 1985. I'm going to try to refer to the issue of general principles versus specific disorders, because it sort of sits in the history of this department, really, that it has made a number of progressions, but actually when I first arrived, the department was best known for depression. Panic became a big thing. I became very interested in OCD, health anxiety, and things continue to move on. A key underpinning of the way that the psychological treatments work has progressed in the department is actually, in a sense, not psychiatry in the way that you would normally think of it, because it's essentially non-diagnostic or pan-diagnostic or trans-diagnostic. It's going for the idea that psychological principles, actually normal psychology underpins much of what we see, but what we're interested in is why people experience particularly severe and particularly persistent problems. The other thing that's apparent from the research from the department is there are quite subtle differences in the meaning that people are attaching to what's happening to them. They have really quite big downstream effects and can affect those key processes. the best treatment, and we've already heard this from several people, the best treatment is derived from work on factors which are specific to the maintenance of particular disorders like PTSD, but at the same time combined with other things which are not specific, general principles, and I think we're going to need to try and think how to balance that. I'm just going to nod in the direction of Chris Fairbairn, who really basically, Chris, in 2003, a few years after I arrived, I don't think that was related, by the way, was talking about a framework of core disorder-specific focus with general maintaining factors. And again, I think that's characteristic of the way that things have developed within the department. I must say something. John, there's this little chapter in the book, which actually I was horrified to see have been cited 6 times, but for me, this changed everything when I read this article, way back in the dawn of time. I just want to remind everybody what a wonderful influence John Teasdale was. David's mentioned him already, but that's there. And then, I've stood on the shoulders of many giants. Only one of these cases have I literally stood on their shoulders, and that was the gentleman on the far right with the ice cream, where I was skiing behind him, he fell, in front of him, he fell, but I ended up standing on his shoulders. But Dan mentioned the people at sabbaticals and so on. These thinkers, influenced us. I know you weren't on sabbatical, David, but do it anyway. In terms of specificity, one of the things which I think really progressed psychological treatments for the department was the identification of specificity. And again, I'm going to blame David Clark this time for his work on specificity, where in particular in panic, the identification of the catastrophic misinterpretation of bodily sensations which go with autonomic arousal was absolutely key to a breakthrough, essentially, and the idea that you could get 85% full remission in a problem like panic disorder was remarkable. All the more remarkable because, if we look at Gelder and Matthews' early work, then actually that work was very clear. That the real problem, that you could treat agoraphobia, but the real problem is that they had panic attacks, because that would set them back, or if they didn't have avoidance, didn't have situational avoidance. David, with a little help from his friends, identified the importance of this, and then we're into the idea of misinterpretation then takes off, and I pick it up with obsessive compulsive disorder and health anxiety, and other people pick it up. And these differences, for example, the misinterpretation in hypochondriasis, health anxiety, illness anxiety disorder as it now is, it turns out it's a bit slower and it doesn't lead to panic, so you don't get the turbo drive. And it's also a different range of symptoms. But by and large, the process is the same. More of that in a moment. So that's panic. That's David Clark. This was revolutionary. And then we go from the specific, because one of the things that David always said, it's memorable because it's so clear, that if and only if the misinterpretation of symptoms is catastrophic, you get panic. But it's kind of not enough, and there was the need to extend it. Why is it that people who repeatedly think they're going to have a heart attack, repeatedly think they're going to pass out, repeatedly think they're going to prove themselves, or whatever it is, still believe that? And what the team identified was that there were two things. There are more than two things, but particularly selective attention and safety-seeking behaviours. And then we're into the general stuff because they're not unique to panic. So we're going general again, we're going from the specific to the general. Safety-seeking, David mentioned it earlier, and I think it was really important because it was kind of an answer to a question that was put to David and I at a meeting in Washington, DC, with a range of people, not December, I think, who said, but there's a neurotic paradox, which is that people, the same thing happens, people repeatedly don't die, how can they still believe it? And so what we suggested was that avoidance behaviour was better conceptualised as safety-seeking behaviour, meaning behaviours intended to prevent harm. And that's why the word seeking is important to me. It's the intention behind the behaviour, more on that in a moment, that these have several effects on the beliefs which are maintaining the problem, such as they prevent disconfirmation, that people fail to discover that things are afraid of don't happen. They also essentially turn every panic attack or every episode of social anxiety into an occasion where they almost died. They would have died had they not done those things, and so on. It can also increase the things which are misinterpreted, and it can of course increase preoccupation and rumination, which is pretty important anti-trans diagnostic. They're also linked to the specific focused threat by the internal logic of the person providing, which means, of course, that there is a degree of cultural specificity, culture broadly defined, that in some cultures, a stomachache means you're having a heart attack. In other cultures, it doesn't. So there's a general thing, and it goes way beyond panic. And then the other question, and this has been raised recently, was what about, but surely some behaviours are helpful. And so is it always bad to use behaviours in the context of helping people deal with anxiety? We know it isn't, so how do we square that with safety seeking? The answer is, and I'm just going to really talk about two of these things, that the maintenance of anxiety across a range of things, and not just anxiety, it also then is generalised across other diagnoses, relates to safety-seeking behaviours, the specific threat-focused behaviours which people deploy. However, there's also something which you can call approach-supporting behaviours. So, essentially, when I'm working with somebody with severe OCD, one of the things I will do is I'll talk to them about their kids as we're putting our hands down the lavatory, as we're getting them to throw keys into bushes and do all the crazy things, not crazy things that you do with OCD. And I'm talking to people and I'm asking them about things which are important in their life, and I'm sometimes telling jokes and we're doing these things. Isn't that a safety-seeking behaviour? No, it's an approach-supporting behaviour, because people do it in order to confront their fears, and it's about confronting your fears, doing things which help people confront their fears. And so I'll get people to handle dirty things with a pair of rubber gloves on the understanding that the rubber gloves will come off at some point. But first, it's that an approach supporting behaviours are a really important thing, part of what we do, and it fits into the whole thing about how psychological treatments work. How psychological treatments work in anxiety links to a transdiagnostic formula. It's really simple. It's so simple. Events and situations, bodily sensations or social situations or whatever if they're negatively interpreted, then produce a range of reactions. My stopwatch is okay. Which essentially maintain negative interpretations and can increase the sensations the person is worried about in the first place. Is this diagnosis specific? Well, kind of, because there's specific stuff thinking about OCD and the specific stuff about panic disorder, but actually health anxiety sits in the middle. The dimensions involved are things like the delay or imminence of threat. Let me just say something about delay or imminence of threat. The importance of that, one of the things that David's team, Michael Gelder's team, our team discovered quite early on was the importance of disconfirmation. The discovering things you're afraid of don't happen. But if what you're afraid of happening is that after you die, because you've had a blasphemous thought, you will burn in hell for all eternity, to disconfirm that would require the murdering the patient and use of Ouija board. The British Psychological Society will not allow the use of Ouija board, it's unethical, so there we go. So where we end up with is, I think, the thing that we've learned, and I think the thing which directly flows from the work that's been carried out in the department, and this is hopefully my last slide, and it says, essentially, that we can know that people suffer from anxiety problems because they think situations are more dangerous than they really are. That's kind of the closest you get to fact in psychology. What treatment does, and this is pan-theoretical, what treatment does is it helps the person to be more flexible in their thinking. It allows them to consider an alternative, less threatening explanation of their problem. That is sitting at the core of all psychological treatments and possibly some non-psychological treatments too. In order for the alternative explanation to be helpful, though, if you're going to tell the person who's got OCD it's not that they're a paedophile, it's that they're a loving father who's afraid of being a paedophile, then it has to make sense. It has to fit with a person's past experience. And if it doesn't, it's going to be rejected. It also has to work when you test it. It has to survive their future experience. And that's the basis for discussion techniques, where we have people make sense, to think more flexibly and have an alternative way of thinking about it, a thing we sometimes call formulation, and behavioural experiments, where we help people get new information that they didn't previously have. And that is informed by the kind of research that we're hearing about today. So, good therapy of all kinds is about 2, sometimes more people working together to find out how the world really works. And then finally, and this is the bit that I think John was talking about in Oslo, good therapy involves 2 experts. It's 2 experts working on the problem in close collaboration, developing a shared understanding that can be used to choose to change. And that's the patient is an expert in their experience, and the therapist who's we hope, an expert in how to help them. Thank you very much.
Really pleased to welcome John Williams here. John is the Managing Director of Birmingham Health Partners, but in a previous role was Head of Neuroscience and Mental Health at the Wellcome Trust, and I think had a key role in shaping and supporting the encouragement of psychological treatments.
Okay, well, hello everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and just to offer some reflections from what was a remarkable and incredibly exciting time to be at the Wellcome Trust and have the privilege of working on behalf of you, representations of the incredibly vibrant UK mental health and neuroscience community. I'm going to keep my comments very brief because I think it's really about the people we're hearing from, the community that Wellcome played an instrumental part in building, and the individuals and their teams that we were able to anchor here in Oxford. And I've just extracted some language from a Wellcome annual report, just to focus on our next speaker. In 1980, Chris Fairbairn arrived in Oxford with an idea. So let's focus on that line, the idea. Let's fast forward to 2017. Let's think about the framework of support that Chris was able to develop his thoughts in. And let's ask some questions about whether or not there are principles here that generalize and apply to you all. And I think if I leave you with a set of key messages, it will be these. The first is to say, back you. I'm just looking at the audience here, and no disrespect to those of us with little or no hair, those of us who've turned grey, many colleagues over 20 years who have blurred with passage of time, if I can put it that way. Back you. Back people with great ideas. I think the second key learning that I would reflect on is you've got to place them in a thriving, multidisciplinary environment. Be that the incredibly powerful Department of Psychiatry in Oxford, but also the sister departments across the wider Oxford environment. You need to bring together complex, informed thought if you're to solve these challenging problems. The third part of it is about how do you build a community of like-minded individuals, but not so alike that they do not challenge one another and really ground each other's thinking in academic rigor. The next part goes without saying, invest in that community. And whether that's about building the infrastructure around them, the provision of long-term, I emphasize long-term, individual support, both for the individual and the team, I think it is critical that funders recognize that it is those different aspects of their toolkit that have to converge to build what's been a dramatically successful program. You need to do it over the long term. If I look back and I think about some of the conversations we had over 20 years in the funding space, we increasingly focused, or have gone through phases where we've focused on short versus long, back to short again. And I think the evidence is out there. When you place long-term bets on individuals with bold ideas that often carry risk, then we have to be confident and say, you know, longer can be better. And we need to understand then how we review with sensitivity and insight how those programs evolve over time. And it's not just about when the work goes well. You know, the reality of academic research is that they are peaks and troughs. They are bumps in the road. And I think the key for a generous funder, key for a funder that can see the big picture and can look beyond those academic hiccups, it's about how do you support people through those tough times so that you do not lose sight of the fact you backed a big idea, you'd embraced risk, and you are persuaded that good things are going to emerge. And finally, you know, in the same way, and I notice Chris in front of a rather interesting series of red wine port, it must have been fascinating tasting. Slow wine, slow food, but actually slow science. And I don't mean sluggish science, I mean actually sitting down and digesting. I mean sitting, contemplating, thinking. It's fashionable to say we should fail fast. It's fashionable to say we break things. But actually, I would argue, and this group and this community has demonstrated, that purposeful, reflective research leads to long-term lasting impact that can directly and has directly impacted on our services and ultimately on the patients that we serve. So I shall finish there and hand back to what we're here for, which is the wonderful science and the academic leaders that the Institute of Psychiatry, the Institute of Psychiatry, that the Department of Psychiatry in Oxford has yielded. I'll finish on that note and hand back to you.
So, to treat us with a history of this research group and to outline a number of its key achievements, it's time to welcome onto the stage the man of the hour, Christopher.
Well, it's a very moving occasion, this, and I'm very grateful to the previous speakers for saying what they said. But what I want to emphasize in this presentation is all this works as part of a team, and I'm just one member of the team. But it's been accomplished by a group that's been funded for a long time in this department. I welcome, and we couldn't have done it except as a group. So, CREDO stands for Centre for Research on Eating Disorders at Oxford, and there's a bit of prehistory, and then I'll describe what it's achieved. The prehistory is, it was founded in 1981, but prior to that, there was a bit of me going on. I trained in medicine here in Oxford. I didn't enjoy it. It didn't suit me at all. But when I arrived at Psychiatry, which I wasn't particularly pro, I was completely overwhelmed by the psychological treatment research group that Michael Gelder was running. I was really interested by what you can achieve by strategic conversations with people who had severe problems, and really started to attend its meetings and got very engaged with it. And that's not a long time ago, 1973, so 5 years into the department. Throughout the rest of my medical school training, I attended research meetings of the group. Then, because I didn't want to work in London, I moved to Edinburgh to train in psychiatry. Came under the influence of an extraordinary person, Bob Kendall, who was a great thinker in psychiatry. And whilst there working in the professorial unit clinic, saw the first cases of bulimia nervosa to arrive, certainly in Edinburgh and probably around the UK, and started to collect them. And through a trial and error process, gradually devised a cognitive behavioural approach to the treatment of what was regarded as an untreatable condition. Now, I'm still in my 20s, so it's an odd situation. I wanted to evaluate the treatments, and Bob Kendall said you've got to go back to Oxford. That's the place that knows how to evaluate psychological treatments. We don't. So I went back with an NHS job, and it's quite interesting. My NHS job was what's called a senior registrar. Then my junior doctor was called Guy Goodwin. He showed quite a lot of promise, I thought, and he's done well. So I feel rather pleased about that, but I take no credit at all. I got an MRC project grant within a year, and that was the beginning of Credo. And initially there were just two of us. There was me and Marianne O'Connor, and we proved inseparable. We actually worked together for the next 36 years. And Marianne takes the credit for a lot of what we've done, the success of what we've done. She's been absolutely fantastic throughout that period. But there were just two of us, which is difficult, and very kindly other people joined us. Wonderful Joan Kirk joined us as a therapist. Peter Cooper helped me with statistics on some epidemiological work I'd done on bulimia. And Zafra Cooper joined us, and she stayed with us, worked with us for about 30 years on a variety of different things. By the 1990s, we got rather big. There were about 20 of us in the department, and people often come and sort of pounce on you every now and then. And they did a site visit with Michael Rutter, who's no pushover, and he said at the end of the site visit, you need a building, because Michael Gelder was about to retire, and the new professor won't be happy with you occupying a third of the offices in the department. Actually, it was a bad suggestion, but within weeks, David was coming back with Anchor and Paul, and it suddenly made sense to have a psychological treatment research building, which was the Wellcome, or is the Wellcome building. More recently, we've shrunk in size, and that's because we've become digital and been very emphasizing or capitalizing on digital research. So we've got smaller, and the other change is that I stepped back from running the group at the end of 2017, and Rebecca Murphy's taken over, ably led by Chaz. Funding, initially funded by a very small project grant, and then Michael Gelder suggested I go for what was then the sort of premier Wellcome Fellowship, called Wellcome Senior Lectureship, and I think to someone's surprise, I got it in 1984, and I basically held the top level of Wellcome Fellowship between 1984 and 2017, which is a record yet to be beaten. I hope someone will beat it in this room. Wellcome have also funded all our research over those years and building. So what have we achieved? There's 4 lines of work, I think. There was this cognitive behavioural treatment for bulimia, which I developed in the late 70s. It was a rather influential publication because, as I said, the disorder was regarded as untreatable. So it's a rather strange situation when you're 29 and you've got a treatment for an untreatable condition, and it put me in the limelight right from a very young age. So I wanted to evaluate it, but you can't evaluate it disorder unless you can measure it. So Zafra Cooper and I spent a very painful 6 to 12 months devising a measure of the psychopathology of eating disorders. And this measure has been used worldwide ever since. So there aren't any eating disorder treatment trials that don't use this measure. So that was a big impact from the beginning, and we needed it to start doing treatment research. We conducted the first trials on bulimia, 2 of them through the 80s. Then this work was picked up by people all over the place. By 2000, there were 30 trials on the treatment of bulimia, mainly focusing comparing CPT with other treatments. One we did, or sort of did, was that, and it shows what you can do even before the internet, was we had therapists, people randomized to 2 treatments, 100 in California, 100 in New York, and I did the supervision from UK. They relied on fax machines and cassettes that were traveling through FedEx. It was before you could do anything sort of like we do these days, but it worked. And by 2004, we we were sort of again in the limelight because NICE very early on focused on eating disorders because they're very expensive conditions for the NHS. And NICE came out absolutely categorically that CBT for bulimia was the treatment for bulimia, everyone should have it. And that's still in place to this day. So that was a good achievement for the team, but it's interesting. The treatment was devised in 1980, 81, and it's 2004 before it gets into NICE. Second line of work was in the mid-90s or early 90s. I became aware that some of the people we were treating that didn't quite have bulimia, but it was very like bulimia, got better too quickly. They were very easy to treat. It was very strange. And I became more and more convinced they could treat themselves if they were given the right guidance. So I, in my spare time, wrote a self-help program for recurrent binge eating. It was published as a book called Overcoming Binge Eating. And it was designed for people to treat themselves, and it was designed to be engaging and sort of provide good guidance. This book took off rather. This is some of its covers in its various editions around the world. I've always been very puzzled by this version. It's the German first edition with a man urinating into a fridge. But it's very strange what covers come from the same stimulus to do overcoming binge eating. But yes, people can treat themselves, but many people struggled because it's hard. And so I wanted to work out a scalable way of helping people follow a self-help program. But it had to be scalable, and that means easily scaled up. And so I came up with a method which I call guided self-help, which is a sort of scalable, low-intensity way where a non-specialist can support someone while they follow a self-help program. And that proved to make the treatment much more effective. And it's had a big impact generally, but guided self-help is now used for helping people follow a whole variety of mental health programs. And Overcoming Binge Eating, I think, is the most studied and researched self-help program there is, and is very strongly advocated by NICE to this day. So it's our second appearance in NICE. The next line of work in the late 90s, I decided to just stop just seeing people with binge eating, to see anyone with any eating disorder, and just see what we could do to help them. And it became more and more clear to me and to colleagues at Cooper and Ross Shafran that these people have got so much in common and rather little that differentiates them. And we're dividing them into anorexia, bulimia, and other eating disorders. But actually their similarities far outweigh their differences. And that there were very clear, shared, common processes we could address in treatment that would seem to remove the disorder. So we argued for adopting a trans-diagnostic way of thinking about eating disorders and more generally, that yes, we should focus on diagnostic categories, but in addition we should look across diagnostic categories where it seemed relevant. And this has proved also very influential, this term trans-diagnostic and its way of thinking. And we developed a trans-diagnostic treatment for eating disorders, so a single approach that could be used with any eating disorder. It's called CBT-E. And through the 2000s, we did 2 randomized controlled trials, one with the help of Bob Palmer of Leicester, I think might be here. And this required the welcome to funders, because any funding body, particularly in the States, would not fund the study if it wasn't on a DSM category. And we were doing a whole class of disorders across the disorders, so you have to have a brave funding body that's going to let you break the diagnostic rules. It turned out all very positive. On the way, we did a rather fun study, actually it was done in Copenhagen, where at the Psychoanalytic Institute said they'd come up with a psychoanalytic treatment for bulimia, and they'd like to compare it with ours, and I thought that was fine. And they said, how many sessions do you need? And I said, well, we need 15 usually, perhaps 20. They said, couldn't you do more? I said, no. And we ended up with a trial with an unusual design, 15 sessions of CBT against 100 of psychoanalysis. Clear-cut result that we get 70% of people better, they got 10% of people better. And that's for 100 sessions of psychoanalytic treatment delivered at the Psychoanalytic Institute. So a very good example of specificity and potency, differentiating different interventions. So CBTE has become strongly endorsed by the NHS and by NICE as a treatment for all eating disorders, whatever your diagnosis. So that was our sort of most recent appearance in NICE. And the last line of work I mentioned briefly, there's a huge issue which David highlighted of disseminating psychological treatments. If we developed a drug, the pharmaceutical company would ensure this drug was on mugs facing GPs, on their notepads, and they'd be prescribing it. There would be a mechanism for ensuring people got this drug. There was no equivalent mechanism for psychological treatments. One of the barriers to disseminating psychological treatments is the training in them. Training is laborious, and only small numbers of people get trained by trainers at any one time. And we wondered, can we somehow scale up training by putting it on the internet and having really good training for people who are at basic level to training, delivering psychological treatment. And they learn a complex one remotely on the internet. So we devised a scalable online method for training therapists to deliver rather more complex psychological treatments. And in a series of studies, we've shown that digital training is effective, is highly acceptable, and it permits very large numbers of people all over the world to be simultaneously trained at low cost. So probably at this very moment, there's probably 50 to 100 people logged on training CBTE somewhere in the world on our website, totally free. This is a way to accelerate dissemination of psychological treatments. The future lies in, for us, not in terms of our research in digital treatment. We've digitalized CBTE so it can be delivered online or via an app, and we want to evaluate this. I'm particularly interested in it being directly accessed by sufferers outside healthcare systems, so that they could actually just Google it and then treat themselves as a means of intervening really early before problems get established. But it could be used in primary care too, and Rebecca Murphy's leading this work. I personally moved into global mental health and treatment depression. A few acknowledgements. I have two mentors, and the more I think about it, the more influential they were. One was Michael Gelder, the founder of the department. The other was Bob Kendall in Edinburgh, who was an unbelievably lucid man. I want to acknowledge the participants in our work. It's been completely collaborative with them. We would not have got to where we have got to without working as a team with our patients and participants. The NHS has been vital in terms of primary care and Warford. The department's been great. Guy Goodwin, John Geddes, Michael Gelder have all been incredibly helpful, and the administrators of the Department of Vital have been fantastic, the latest being Moira. And I want to acknowledge colleagues in the Welcome Building, David and Paul particularly, because it's very inspiring working with some people who are really good. Makes you try and keep up with them. Obviously I want to acknowledge the welcome. And last but not least, my team. We've always tended to go punting a lot. So this was us punting in 1989. This was a post-punting party afterwards, punting in 2006, and having a meal at Charles Boathouse to celebrate Marianne's retirement after working with me for 30-something years. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you.
Chris, and to try and thank you.
seen lots of collaboration and mutual support across the generations, but also across fields and across departments, and we'll see more of that. So I'm Kia Nobre. I hold a chair between the Department of Psychiatry and of Experimental Psychology, where I'm also head, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this session this morning. So this morning we heard about some of the foundations, where we have the innovation of introducing psychological therapies. And now I think what we'll hear is the next generation that is going to be breaking the next big challenge, which is to break the taboos and help provide and disseminate psychological therapies to people who need it with no shame and at scale. The ground is probably still arid, but it's more fertile than it has ever been. And what we'll hear about in this next session are the new generation gardeners who are building the future laurels of the field. So to start off, we have Willem Kijken. Willem is the professor of mindfulness and psychological science at Oxford, and Willem is interested in bringing evidence-based knowledge into generating effective treatments for individuals with depression. So, Willem.
Thank you, Kina. I don't know about anyone else, but it feels like an extraordinary privilege to be part of this celebration of the 50 years of this Department of Psychiatry and the extraordinary work that's gone on here these last 50 years. I was saying to some of the speakers in the first session how much of their work feels like it's in the DNA of how I think and work, and I think that's true of many, many clinical academics, I'm sure, around the world. I'm going to be talking about the prevention of depression and particularly the place of mindfulness-based approaches in that. And I'm going to be painting with quite a broad brush, but my slides will have on them the references for anybody who wants to go into the granularity of any of the strokes and any of the slides. Before I do that, I think one of the themes that's come through is how much the challenges that we face in the way we've heard this morning, and Kira introduced this session, can never really be done by individual people. They have to be done by teams of people. And these are some of my current collaborators, the extraordinary research team I'm lucky to lead here in Oxford, and the postgraduate students, both current and past. And these are some of the people who I would count as my most precious collaborators over the years. So, depression, just taking that number, 300 million people currently around the world will suffer from depression, some 6 to 12% of the world population. And within their lifetime, maybe as many as 1 billion people around the world currently will experience common mental health problems. This is an extraordinary challenge for the next 50 years, to find psychological approaches that work, that are accessible, that are at scale. And what I'd like to suggest is that one of the promising ways of doing this is to think about prevention. And this, I think, is particularly true for depression for a number of reasons. Perhaps most notably, that unlike chronic physical health problems, it tends to begin to happen early in life, in late adolescence and early adulthood. It often will run a relapsing and recurrent course. People who have one episode of depression are more likely than not to get another episode of depression. And epidemiological data suggests that they may spend up to 20% of their life in a depressed condition. This is an extraordinary challenge that we face. And I think that prevention is one of the ways in which we can potentially make quite big inroads into this. We've heard something about the background. Of course, John Teasdale was here in that first wave that David put up on his slide, and he put marking the third wave. These are the three people who developed a preventative approach for depression amongst adults. It's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It's a group-based intervention, and it is intended to take people who are at very high risk of this recurrent depressive pattern that I've described and help them to learn the skills that can keep them well in the long term. We have treatments for active depression. We have CBT amongst other evidence-based approaches, and we have probably much more accessible antidepressant treatments. And this treatment is focused on the prevention of depressive relapse and recurrence. Does it work? Is it effective? There have been at least 10 RCTs now, and this is an individual patient data meta-analysis, and again, I'm not going to go into the granularity, but the comparison to usual care, MBCT is more effective than usual care. It adds value in terms of preventing depression in people at high risk, and crucially, it seems to be as effective, if not marginally more effective, for people on a long-term maintenance dose of antidepressants. And my colleague Alice Tickell is going to speak about some ongoing work with that after me. So this is what we've done historically. So Mark Williams founded the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. I had the privilege of taking that on from him. What are we doing now? What are we planning to do in the next little while? We've heard about the translational approach to the development of psychological therapies that the Wellcome has so generously funded over the years, and this is a major part of our work. This is a slide from the wonderful Matthew Johnston in his book, I Had a Black Dog. And what you see here is a man who is, in the middle of the night, he wakes up, and the mechanism for depressive onset, relapse, and recurrence is thought to be depressive thinking, the activation of negative thinking about the self, the future, and the world, which very quickly, as Paul described, can proliferate into the onset of a depressive relapse. He uses the metaphor which Winston Churchill also used of a black dog. It's a very powerful image, I think. And this is Matthew Johnston talking about mindfulness as a way of working with depression. So what he's doing here, what MBCT intends to do, is to help people first to stabilize their attention. And secondly, once they've stabilized their attention, to see this depressive thinking, recognize it, and then the crucial thing the data is pointing to, and the references at the bottom of the three images of graduate students who are working with me or have worked with me, is the ability then to de-center from those negative thinking. You can see the black dog is in the window. It's not gone away. It's not been chased away. But Matthew, in this image, is trying to describe a changed relationship to the depression and the depressive thinking. And the data is beginning to really, both the psychological data, but the behavioral data, and we're beginning to do some neuroscience work, is beginning to articulate what this mechanism might be. And of course, the crucial point about that is the more we can be clear about the mechanism, the more we can sharpen up our treatments and really focus in on those interventions. The other area we're moving on to in terms of prevention is thinking about the developmental window before depression and major mental health problems typically begin. And this is a focus in Oxford more broadly, but most mental health problems will arise in late adolescence and early adulthood, certainly depression will. Can we work in that developmental window before depression arises? And there's an ongoing program of work funded by the Wellcome Trust. We're looking at mechanisms, we're looking at effectiveness, we're looking at scalability and implementation, and we're asking a very fundamental question. Does mindfulness training in adolescence have the potential to shift the population away from psychological problems by addressing key processes of mental regulation that operate across the spectrum from risk to resilience? Just to make this a bit more explicit in terms of scalability, this now is a universal intervention. So it's being offered to kids as a whole across the distribution. And the argument is that these are mechanisms that might be at play to differing degrees of salience for kids across that risk of resilience, but may have value for young people who are in the moderate and flourishing range as well. Another program we're working on is around implementation. As David put it quite boldly, none of this has much value if these treatments are not actually accessible. So this was a piece of work funded by the NIHR, in which we went into the NHS and we said, why is this treatment that's recommended by NICE that seems to work so rarely available? And we built an explanatory model based on a whole series of case studies and an enormous amount of work. And we are currently, with support from the Oxford BRC, trying to develop some resources to support people in implementing MBCT within the health service. We're also thinking about impact, and probably in two ways. The first way is in terms of training the next generation of MBCT therapists. Our approach to this, we've heard a number of different approaches so far today. Our approach to this is to articulate a training pathway, a sort of standard for how to train the next generation of MBCT therapists. and then to begin to mentor training centres of excellence around the world. So we developed mentor training centres in Hong Kong, mainland China, and we're mentoring centres in Japan, Singapore, and South America, amongst other places. And we're also working on policy. And through the Mindfulness Parliamentary Group, we have made sure that there are some evidence-based policy recommendations, and that was a report was published in 2015. We're now working through on can we support the pull-through of those recommendations into practice in the real world. This is Richard Layard and Mark Williams and others at number 10. This was pre-Brexit. There's no attempt to solve the Brexit problems. This predates this by some time. And then I think the final one is one to which I really don't know the answer, but feels an incredibly interesting question, is if we have a sense of what works and what might be helpful, how can we make this accessible to as many people as possible? We've heard a number of different ideas about this. So far, I want to just point you to Mark and Danny's book, Mindfulness, Finding Peace in a Frantic World. Tries to articulate the principles, sold 1 million copies, translated in 35 languages. And who knows whether this is one way of solving that problem. Headspace, nothing to do with us, but many people here will know Headspace. 42 million customers. That's an extraordinary way of making principles of psychological therapies accessible. So just to summarise, while MBCT is not a panacea, it does clearly offer people, adults, with a substantial history of depression, a new approach to learning skills to stay well in the long term. Our work now is moving to new groups of people, earlier in the life course of depression, and tackling issues of impact, accessibility, and implementation. A copy of the slides are up on my Twitter account, and many of the publications that are cited on there are open access on my website.
Okay, so next we have who might be the youngest of our speakers today. Alice Tickell just completed her undergraduate degree in experimental psychology and is now in the Oxford Mindfulness Centre. So here's the future.
Thank you, yeah, for the introduction. It's so nice to have my name pronounced correctly because I always get called Alice Tickell. So I'm going to start by telling you about a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who has a history of recurrent depression and has been on antidepressants for quite a long time now. And he's feeling well, so he's considering weaning off them. But he's really torn about this because he's aware that if he does this, there's a chance that he may relapse in the future. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and fear around this decision. And to me, this conversation really highlights the importance of providing people with a history of depression with ways to support their recovery, alternative ways, to promote people's autonomy and their confidence in having a future without the devastating effects of depression. And Willem already introduced mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and I work as part of his group to research the effects of MBCT and its potential to support people with a history of depression to discontinue from their antidepressants should they wish to and stay well over the long term. So depression can run a relapsing and recurrent course, so clinical management needs to involve long-term support to prevent this. And currently, most patients in the NHS are offered antidepressant medication to support their ongoing recovery, with the recommendation from NICE that those at high risk of relapse should maintain antidepressant medication for at least 2 years. However, while antidepressants suppress or reduce the symptoms of depression when you're on them, there's no evidence to suggest that they reduce your underlying vulnerability to becoming depressed in the future, which means that if people decide to discontinue, they have a higher chance of relapsing in the future. However, there are many reasons why someone may not wish to stay on antidepressants for a long time. For instance, they may experience unpleasant side effects associated with this. And as David Clark mentioned, people tend to express a preference for psychological therapies or alternatives to medication. So MBCT was developed as a treatment that targets people's underlying vulnerability to become depressed in the future and could offer an alternative to people who wish to discontinue their antidepressants and stay well. And so a number of research trials have shown that people who engage in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and then discontinue their antidepressants have comparable long-term outcomes to those who remain on antidepressants, which is what you can see on this graph here, people's outcomes over the course of 24 months. And they're largely comparable. However, clinicians in the real world are often skeptical of the excellent results obtained with cognitive behavioural treatments in research trials because it suggested that the effects observed in research trials don't generalise. For instance, because the more difficult to treat patients may be excluded due to the exclusion criteria that are common to research trials, or that the usual format of treatment may be difficult to comply with. So it's really important that once a treatment has been implemented in the real world to go back and evaluate it again to answer the question of whether a treatment retains its effectiveness when it's delivered in the real world. So this is what we sought to do. And to answer this question, we collected data from more than 1,500 patients who had gone through an MBCT program across 5 NHS services. And this was facilitated by IAPT and that they mandated that services have to collect outcome data from their patients, which makes it a lot easier to evaluate the outcomes of psychological therapy in the NHS. And we sampled data from 5 services from a range of regions across England and a range of different models of service delivery, including IAPT and also secondary care, to try and sample a representative sample of real-world patients. And we compared the characteristics of these patients and the clinical outcomes to those taking part in MBCT and the NHS to those in research trials to see whether the effectiveness was carried over. And what we found was that patients, as clinicians suspected, were indeed more diverse. So for instance, they were more ethnically diverse, and they also entered treatment with a greater severity of depression symptoms. However, what we found was that despite this, treatment was acceptable, so we observed almost identical levels of session attendance and dropout to in randomized controlled trials. There was a comparable effect on depression symptoms, and there was also low rates of deterioration of depression symptoms across treatment, which attests to the acceptability, effectiveness, and safety of MBCT when it's delivered in real-world healthcare services. In addition to this quantitative data, we also have a program of work that seeks to capture patients' subjective experiences of using MBCT as a way to discontinue their antidepressants, to provide information that could support patient decision-making when considering treatment options for recurrent depression. So in a large study, 212 patients with recurrent depression taking antidepressants took part in MBCT to discontinue, and these patients were followed up for 2 years following this. And what they found following was that at the end of the 2 years, 70% of people had fully discontinued, 17% had reduced, and 13% hadn't discontinued or had resumed their full dosage by the end of the trial. So what we were really interested in was to look at people's experiences across these different categories, to understand what people's experiences were, to understand those who had fully discontinued, what had facilitated that process, and if those who hadn't discontinued, what might have been a barrier. So in-depth interviews were conducted, and I'm going to present to you the preliminary results of our thematic analysis. So when MBCT facilitated antidepressant discontinuation, this was across 4 main areas. So firstly, as Willow mentioned, MBCT teaches people coping skills that aim to contain or prevent the onset of depressive episodes. And so people found these helpful, and in some cases were able to use them as a direct replacement to using antidepressants. So this person said, once I realise I'm getting depressed, I do 3 to 4 meditations, so the next day I feel well, which to me is better than taking the pill. And these meditations could be anywhere between 5 minutes to 30 or 40 minutes long. The second point was that before treatment, many people endorsed a medical model of their depression, so that they described depression to be caused by a serotonin deficiency or imbalance, which then acted as a barrier to discontinuation because they weren't sure how a psychological therapy could mitigate what they perceived to be a medical problem. However, when engaging in psychological therapy, they were taught a new cognitive behavioral model of depression and its recurrent nature, which facilitated their confidence in using psychological techniques to stay well. Another thing that facilitated discontinuation was that, so while a lot of people knew that they were depressed, many reported that they hadn't fully accepted it before treatment, whereas MBCT facilitated more acceptance towards the fact they were suffering from a mental health condition, while on antidepressants, while they helped to suppress or reduce the symptoms, this helped to sort of prolong people's non-acceptance because they were able to keep going and carry on without fully examining the causes of their depression, whereas this allowed them to re-examine the causes, problem solve, and put in place new strategies to support recovery over the long term, which would support them to discontinue. And lastly, learning psychological techniques also gave people more of an understanding of what they could do themselves, which supported personal agency because they felt like the solution was in their hands as opposed to relying on something external to themselves to support their well-being. We also identified a number of barriers to discontinuation. So for instance, people's expectations of treatment sometimes got in the way. So people who came to treatment with very high expectations, thinking that mindfulness could be a magic fix or allow them to avoid their symptoms of depression. So for instance, this person said, I got to euphoric about mindfulness thinking it's a cure for everything, and it's not. If people's expectations weren't met, then in some cases this led them to abandon treatment. So this was a major barrier. Another barrier was that people who weren't able to maintain a regular mindfulness practice found it more difficult to discontinue. This person said, I didn't realise I needed to keep practicing. Our teacher said practicing is like preparing a parachute. You can't pack it once you're falling. I now understand what she meant. Related to this, people found it really helpful if their GPs were involved closely in the tapering process and gave them reminders to practice and MBCT, whereas those who didn't have this support were less likely to discontinue because they felt that they didn't have the reassurance that someone would be there to support them if they had difficulties. And lastly, people's stage of depression also acted as a barrier. Some people just felt like they weren't stable enough to consider discontinuation, and in this case, people chose to remain on their antidepressants but use mindfulness techniques as supplementary. As you can see, this person said, why rock the boat when I can draw upon MBCT knowledge and have a low dosage of antidepressants? One day I may decide to stop medication because it's the right time to do so. So in conclusion, despite concerns that the impressive effects from research trials wouldn't translate into the real world, data from 5 NHS services suggests that MBCT is acceptable, effective and safe for NHS patients in real-world healthcare services. And ongoing data collection from services will support this ongoing process. Our qualitative research has also shown that participating in MBCT can support antidepressant discontinuation, for instance by providing new skills, providing acceptance and new model of depression, and personal agency in managing recovery. We've also identified factors that could support this further, and above all, patients reported that they valued simply being offered a psychological alternative where they hadn't been offered this before because it allowed them to make an informed choice based on whether they wanted to use antidepressants or psychological therapy going forward. And I think this really highlights the importance of developing psychological therapies for real-world NHS services to support personalised and bespoke treatment approaches based on people's treatment preferences, whether that be psychological therapy, medication, or a combination of both of these. I just want to end by thanking our participants, my colleagues, and also our funders, and for you all for being here today.
Of Psychiatry, and she's going to probably tell us about some of her amazing work with children in schools and school-based interventions.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience of school-based mental health care, the opportunities, the challenges, and I've taken a leap and said this is a blueprint for the future of what we're doing and what we're learning. So what I'm going to do is just, in this short time, tell you about the context. a little bit about adolescence, introduce this whole group to you all, and think a little bit then about schools. So what is the global context? Well, I've put that picture there because actually 26% of the population of the world right now is under the age of 18. So we have this phenomenon, it's called a youthquake, but it's the largest proportion of young people in the history of humanity right now. And 80% of those are living in low middle income countries. So if we're really thinking about the future health of the global population, we really need to be thinking, I think, about adolescents, and then really about adolescents in low middle income countries. Now, what we know about low, contexts that aren't high income nations and such is that access to mental health care is very, very different. In the vast majority of sub-Saharan African countries, there might be one child adolescent psychiatrist if you're lucky. So although we complain a lot in the UK about long waiting times and the complete absence of psychiatrists and mental health professionals for children, it's a completely different experience in low resource settings. But, and the big hopeful but is, there seem to be schools absolutely everywhere. So, this has been one of the Millennium Development Goals, to rapidly and dramatically improve the access of children to education. And so, obviously this picture is showing you the range of schools that exist, but the reality is that schools are absolutely everywhere. And so I think that if we want to be thinking about how to address the needs of the next generation and how to be kind of thinking about the mental health needs of these children, the only really institutional structure that I think we should be learning about and thinking about utilising in a serious way is the education system. Obviously schools are different contexts, different class sizes, different resources. Clearly it can't be teachers that are going to do it, but I do think the setting and the structure of schools needs to be key. So I think that we have a lot of learning in high-income countries, especially North America. We're learning more in the UK, but hopefully we're going to make this kind of translatable and useful for a much broader group. What's the national context? Well, the national context is that we know that services are poorly accessed, and in the 2017 UK child data, it's about 12.9% of children seem to have a mental disorder. A significant portion of those have physical life-limiting illnesses as well. So the UK is really investing heavily in this area, and we've got a green paper, and there is a commitment to bring a new tranche of mental health workers into schools as part of the green paper. And I've been involved in some of the advising and thinking around it, and I think it's going to be a really complicated few years, but it's a really interesting opportunity to learn and understand about that. And that thinking is really on the prevention thinking, it's not on the treatment thinking. But in reality, we know that we're treating a minority of the young people that need care. And the government goal is to increase that to 25% of children within the next 5 years who need mental health care access it. Which honestly, if you change that to the word diabetes, it would be completely unacceptable to everyone in the room that only 25% of children with diabetes have access to care, but it seems to be a somewhat okay goal for mental health care, and I would challenge that. I think it's terrible given the lifelong consequences of illness. So, what do we know about childhood? Well, you've got to do a lot in a very short period of time. You've got to grow physically, you've got to learn a lot, you've got to manage your emotions, you've got to develop a moral compass. Actually, humans are the only animals that have this pubertal growth phase. So it's a massive period of change and development in the brain as well as in the body. And it seems to be pretty unique to our species. So it's obviously a time of change, of development, but also of threat as well. And I think that's where the vulnerabilities and the major kind of increased vulnerability to mental illness emerges. This is also what's happening in modern society, kind of puberty's earlier. Sleep seems to be affecting everybody. There's increased rates of family discord, there's exam pressures, austerity, social media all seem to be playing a role in the complex lives of young people developing today. So let's focus a little bit more on schools. Well, there is an important relationship between education and mental health. Children spend more time in schools than in any other institutional setting. Those that don't do well educationally have mental health problems. Those that have mental health problems seem educationally. The massive meta-analysis of school behaviour programmes showed improved educational outcomes. So there's a very important relationship between these two. What happens at school? Well, a whole range of other things. You get contact with teachers. Disruptive behaviour and managing it seems to be central to the burnout of teachers. I personally think teachers are our most precious resource if they're thinking about the next generation. And if they often say it's the 1 to 2 kids in the classroom they couldn't manage that made them leave the profession. We also know about stress contagion, so a teacher arriving to the classroom stressed then raised cortisol levels in all the children in that class for the rest of the day. Peers, so obviously a great thing for many people, but a disastrous thing for some children, and bullying in particular seems to cast a long shadow over the life of many people who've experienced it, and then the whole exam culture. So what type of school interventions are there? Well, I think there's the promotion, the prevention, and the treatment approaches. I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but what I want you to know is that there are lots of different things that have been tried and have been examined. So when we say school-based mental health interventions, what are they? Well, I think we need to think about who gives the treatment. So that can be anything from peers in the school to external mental health services and anything in between, teachers, teaching assistants, school nurses, school psychologists. So when we're thinking about this whole area, we need to think about all those potential players. Then to whom? Do we want to do something for a whole school? Do we want to do something for a classroom? Do we want to do something for those that are identified at risk? Do we want to do something for those that are diagnosed? And then what exactly should we do? Should it be, there's a whole range of interventions that have been tried in schools. And then this is what I call kind of important prevailing issues around whose responsibility is the evidence base, concept of confidentiality in school and consent. And over the last, I don't want to say 15 years, but it is that unfortunately, over the last 15 years I've been kind of trying to explore various areas of that space. So we started off with Alan Stein developing a mental health service for refugee children who are identified at risk in Oxford schools. And through that we learned that actually the vast majority of these children who do need care are not accessing services. But actually they seem to like to be accessed within the school context. It seems to be a relatively acceptable location for them. We've also, I'm currently now looking at peers and peer interventions in schools. I've done some work on teachers, so developing a toolbox to teach them in 2 hours a whole range of psychotherapeutic skills, and seeing that kind of 6 months later, 20% of them have used them with over 5 children. This is a very quick fix thing, and seeing whether it gets used. Teachers say that they want to learn, well, they really specifically used a lot around sleep and relaxation. And then we come to Oxford Health, which I think has been an unbelievably valued collaborator in our research interests. So I approached Oxford Health, I said, we're missing a trick here, we've put school nurses in every school, why don't we bring mental health services alongside that? And Oxford Health has given resources, given really a commitment, and went out on a limb to work together with us. And as a result of that, we've put mental health services into every school. So we have a named mental health professional in every school, and that's giving us an opportunity to say that we really want to build a platform where we can maybe link, where we can learn, and we can really evaluate service change. We've done a lot to develop the evidence base, whose responsibility is I won't go into, but consent I think is a really important area, and one that I'm hoping to go to. So that's what we've been doing in Oxford. And I'm just going to end with this, that I really think with this, we're missing a trick if we're going to be thinking only about the individual here. So you've got the child, but the child is in a school context, they're in a family context, they're in a peer context, they're in a community, there's policy that impacts it. And if we want to think about interventions and how to work, I really think we need to move away from only thinking about the individual and be thinking of ways to think about the whole system. So in conclusion, schools can democratise access to services because the vast majority of children go to school. We can really work to promote early identification. It's part of the system of care, and I think we need to be thinking about targeting. We know those high-risk groups, the children from families of discord, those that have been bullied, those that have physical health problems, and we need to think about teachers as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mina, for that awesome talk. And next we have Kathy Kresman. here yet. She's here on April Fool's. Yes. And she's a new research professor between the Department of Psychiatry and of Experimental Psychology. And she works on developing and implementing psychological therapies in children and adolescents. Do you want a word more from that?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kira. It's really great to be here. Quite daunting when I'm going to be starting work here in a couple of weeks' time, but I do, as Willem said, I do feel very privileged to be here, and I think it's been a really nice opportunity for me to just to reflect a bit really on the influence of Oxford psychiatry on my work. So I hope you don't mind, I'm going to indulge in a bit of reflection. And so I came to Oxford for the very first time in 1992 as an undergraduate at St Anne's College just down the road. And in 1995 I spent 8 weeks cycling up and down to the Department of Psychiatry for tutorials with Paul Sarkopoulos, who I went to see for my psychological disorders tutorials. And myself and my colleague Karen, who went on to be a pilot, with Paul, and he would just enthusiastically fling in press paper, recently published papers, other things that were on the way at us every week. And it really was genuinely inspiring. It was so exciting to see how a really clear understanding of psychological mechanisms can lead to the development of such effective treatments. So that was a very influential time, even though it was just 8 weeks of my life. And then after graduating from here, then I came and had a job right here, probably in where this, whatever was here before this particular building was built. And worked here in the Department of Neuropsychology, and I was doing things that were completely unrelated to cognitive therapy, but just on a complete one-off occasion I heard a talk by Michael Sharp, where he was talking about cognitive behaviour therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome. And this really reminded me that what I had been most excited about during my degree had been that clear understanding of psychological mechanisms, how they could be applied to treatments, and that really encouraged me to then pursue clinical psychology, which I did. And after that, I went on to do my PhD, and since that time I focused on anxiety disorders in children. One of the main reasons for that is really this issue about trying to prevent problems where we can. And anxiety problems commonly, well, they have a median age of onset of 12, so half of all the people who will experience an anxiety disorder in their life will first have difficulties before they leave primary school. So that really encouraged me to try and focus on trying to make sure that children of that age and their families are able to access effective treatments. And I've realised, from looking back, how much the work that I've done has been influenced by the experiences in Oxford. And I think what I see as the Oxford approach, and I think we've heard about a lot this morning, is really spelled out very nicely by David in this paper, which he mentioned earlier on today. And that really is about, first of all, identifying the core abnormality through clinical interviews, using broader psychology paradigms, constructing a clear theoretical account which explains why particular abnormalities are not self-correcting, which we've heard a lot about this morning, testing those hypothesized maintenance factors in experimental studies, then using that information to develop specialised treatments to revise those maintenance factors that have been identified, testing those treatments in RCTs, and then increasing availability through dissemination studies. And we had a really nice example of that in the previous talk. And then obviously something that the groups have gone on to do, and we've heard about this morning from Anka and also from Chris, is then increasing availability using technology. So I just wanted to sort of demonstrate quickly how we've tried to follow this approach to try to overcome the problems that we have in accessibility of treatments for anxiety disorders in children. So when I started working in the field of anxiety disorders, actually cognitive behavioural treatments have been tested for children, and actually outcomes are pretty good. So this is Tony James, who is also here in Oxford, and he conducted a Cochrane review which identified that mostly generic CBT approaches were effective in treating anxiety disorders in children. But the biggest challenge that we had, and we've heard about this today, is access. And my colleague Tessa, who will be coming here to Oxford with me, conducted a study across the country where she identified children through schools by screening parents, teachers and children, and then following up families where children seem to have elevated symptoms and doing diagnostic interviews in order to identify children who met diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder. And what she found was that 2/3 of those families had tried to seek some support, only just over 1/3 had accessed some kind of support, only 15% had accessed a mental health specialist, and only 2% of children had accessed the one psychological treatment that has an evidence base. And I think, using Mina's thought experiment, you just have to swap the words anxiety disorders for any other health condition, and it really emphasises quite how appalling that is. So this is recent work conducted just in the last couple of years. So to try to address this, we need to think about how we can understand psychological mechanisms in a way that allow us to focus our work and be as efficient as we can so that we can make treatments most accessible. And so from very early work, when I was at UCL sharing a room with Emily Holmes, it became very clear from talking to a lot of families and from early cross-sectional and longitudinal work that families would often get into a vicious cycle in which, having had experience of your child being very responsive in an anxious way to new situations, parents would understandably start to expect their child to respond in a negative way if they were in a challenging situation, and so would, again, understandably take great care to try to minimise their child's distress. But unfortunately, what parents were describing seemed to be that then meant that acted as a safety mechanism, where children would get the opportunity to overcome their fears. And so we tested this in a couple of quite simple experimental studies. So here's the first one. And here we manipulated parental expectations about how distressed their child would be in a particular situation. And what we found was, despite the situation being exactly the same, when parents were led to hold those negative expectations, they were more likely to step in and be more involved in the task when they had to then do a challenging task with their child. That's not at all surprising, but the problem is that then when you do that with a child who is anxious, it means that it appears to lead to more anxiety. So this was another experimental study, and here the red bars are children with high trait anxiety, the children with orange bars are children with low trait anxiety. And what this shows is, in this case, we trained parents to act in more kind of involved, potentially slightly more controlling ways when they help their child prepare to do a challenging task. And what we found was that for those very laid-back children, it didn't matter at all what the parents did. You could kind of get as involved as you like. But for children who had high levels of anxiety, they seemed to be particularly sensitive to these parental responses. And then when we observed the children doing the challenge task independently, they were observed by blind raters as being significantly more anxious when they had to come to do the task. So this suggests that these natural responses can lead to a vicious cycle, which may promote anxiety within the family. So on the basis of this, we focused on developing treatments which could empower parents to help their children through focusing on building up parents' expectations about what their children are able to manage and developing alternative ways to support their children when their children were struggling with anxiety. And we've now tested this in a couple of RCTs and have found that the treatment is effective. So by 6 months follow-up, we have about 75% of the children who have recovered. And the thing to really highlight is, because we're working with the parents, we can work really efficiently because it's about how they can be applying strategies in their child's day-to-day life. So these treatments take 5 hours and take the sort of guided self-help approach that Chris introduced earlier. And we've also found that these seem to be highly cost-effective compared to other brief psychological treatments. So this provides us a potential way to increase access because we can deliver these effective treatments in just about 5 hours rather than the typical 16 to 20 hours that treatments are delivered in when you work individually with children. And we've also then followed the Oxford approach and then looking at, well, can we promote dissemination by looking at how this works in the real world? And so here we collected data from routine NHS services and found that whilst we weren't unfortunately able to get a lot of actual sessional data, we were able to see that 75% of children didn't need any further treatment after this very brief intervention. Then following the method further to the point where it's got to with many of the groups is then about, well, how can we increase availability further through technology? So over the last couple of years we've been doing a really fun co-design project working very closely with parents and children and clinicians to develop an online version of this treatment that families can use. And we're about to start quite a large programme of work which involves identifying children and offering these treatments directly through primary schools, so trying to capture some of the issues that Mina mentioned in her talk. There's still quite a lot to do, and the main thing that we need to focus on next is what we do for those children who aren't benefiting from these sort of fairly general, brief interventions. Actually, the outcomes that we get are really not very different from the outcomes that people have achieved in much more intensive treatment. So it seems that that's not necessarily the answer, it's just to add on the treatments that are already available. And in my view, what we really need now is to continue to sort of apply the Oxford approach and to be really understanding much better about what are the mechanisms that continue to maintain anxiety in those families that are not benefiting from these existing approaches. And I'm really looking forward to working on that here, hopefully with many of you. And I was very aware in putting my slides together, I was putting them together on International Women's Day, that all the photos I've put up so far were from these fantastic male up-to academics. So I just wanted to finish by, although I'm looking forward to working with a lot of wonderful people here, I'm really excited about working with this group of fantastic female academics who are here in psychiatry and also other related disciplines. So thanks very much.
Our next researcher is Jessica Bird. She's an NIHR research fellow, and she's working on paranoid thoughts in adolescents.
Thank you. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been working in the department for a couple of years now with Daniel Freeman in the OCAP team, where I'm doing a doctoral fellowship. And I want to tell you a bit today about my research into paranoia in young people and adolescents, and why I think we need to be paying more attention to paranoia at this age for early intervention. So paranoia is the unfounded fear that other people are intentionally trying to cause you harm. Paranoia is one of the most common symptoms of psychosis, and you could often think about paranoia in the context of persecutory delusions. Yet we also know that paranoia is very common in the general population. And now, based on many years of research, often led by Daniel Freeman, we understand paranoia and persecutory beliefs to form part of a broader continuum of paranoia, rooted within normal adaptive concerns about social evaluation, vulnerability, and trust. Because trust is a very tricky thing. Every day we need to make decisions about who to trust, and this involves a judgment about another person's intentions towards you and a judgment about whether they are safe. It's uncertain and it makes you vulnerable. And there's no age where we feel more socially vulnerable than during adolescence. At this age, we are trying to figure out who we are whilst trying to navigate a huge amount of social change, and where fitting in with our peers and being accepted by our friends becomes a key motivator of our behaviour. And so much so that our processing of social information is heightened at this age, so our brains become more attuned to reading the intentions of other people and how other people perceive us. And we become hypersensitive to perceived rejection, which is experienced emotionally as catastrophic. So it seems that adolescence provides what we see as the psychological conditions on which unfounded attribution of threat and paranoia could potentially flourish. And indeed, we've recently shown in a small cohort of 800 young people in Leicestershire that paranoia, occasional feelings of paranoia, is a common part of daily life for many young people, with many of our paranoid thoughts in our study being reported at least weekly for 20 to 30% of the young people. And like anxiety and depression, we can see that this paranoia exists on this continuum, where clinical paranoia might represent shifts along this continuum, where paranoid thoughts become more In fact, most of the research at this age seems to focus more broadly on psychotic symptoms rather than specific symptoms such as paranoia. So we've recently been doing a study with the local CAM services, and in particular the South Oxfordshire CAMS team and the hyper-adolescent unit, to look at the prevalence and impact of paranoia in a range of typical presenting teenagers to adolescent mental health services. So we have data from 300 young people, and as you can see, this is a very typical CAMS group. Most of these young people presenting with anxiety and depression, self-harm, emotional dysregulation, neurodevelopmental conditions, and actually only 6 of the 301 young people that we've surveyed were presenting with psychosis. So so actually just to say, we've only just finished recruiting for this study, so we don't have all the results of this yet, but I'm going to tell you about just some of the preliminary findings from this today. And we also have, within this study, actually done interviews with young people who have high character paranoia but non-psychotic mental health problems as well. So I'll tell you a bit about this too. So as expected, we can see that actually paranoia seems to be a more common experience in this general CAMS sample of young people with a range of mental health problems at significantly higher rates than the general population, with over a third presenting with at least mild paranoia and 20% scoring in moderate to severe range. Over half of the sample of the young people reported that they felt that people were lying to them on purpose, making sly comments to upset them. It's described by this 15-year-old boy: I get feelings that people are making fun of me even if I don't know or not. I get feelings that people are trying to plot against me. I've got a feeling that someone might be following me. Over a third felt unsafe around people everywhere they go, and over 40% felt scared of what strangers will do to them. This 12-year-old girl describes, I don't like going out. When I go out, it feels like somebody is following me. I worry I'll get kidnapped or someone's going to hurt me. So it seems that paranoia seems to be a common issue across a range of mental health problems in young people that's not confined to psychosis. But we need to ask also, what's the clinical relevance of this paranoia amongst other mental health problems? Well, we are yet to look at the data that we have about the relationship between paranoia and other clinical outcomes, but we can get some insights from the school cohort study that I mentioned earlier, where we looked into the causal interactions between paranoia and a range of variables. And we did this using a Bayesian network analysis that used an approach called directed acyclic graphs that uses a fancy algorithm to sample, in our case, 50,000 different causal models of the ways that these variables can interact, and to learn what the most likely causal interactions are. And in this, what we found is that there seemed to be, with everything else controlled, there's a strong causal relationship between negative affect and paranoia. Now, although this the direction of this relationship was uncertain, it seems slightly more likely that negative affect causally affected paranoia, but also that this relationship seemed to be reciprocal as well. So this is a reciprocal interaction between anxiety, depression, and paranoia. And we can see this in young people's reports. So the paranoia makes my anxiety really bad, like panic attacks, because I don't know who to trust. I panic and I panic even more, especially when I'm out. Somebody might jump me and I'm home thinking about my friends leave me. And after I think, why am I doing this issue? Feeling of not always being watched or people going to do something bad, it clouds my thoughts and it's very heavy on my shoulders. It decreases my mood even more than I already need it to be. So this suggests that paranoia may likely emerge in the context of anxiety and depression, and that these difficulties may causally interact in ways that increase young people's distress. One of the things that we also found from our causal model was that paranoia seems to have a very strong relationship with peer difficulties, in that paranoia seems much more likely to contribute to peer difficulties and vice versa. And this social impact of paranoia was described by many of the young people that we've spoken to. So they describe how the lack of trust was a barrier between themselves and their friends, and stopping people being able to get to know them and form close relationships. That it puts puts a strain on friendships when you don't feel safe enough to go out and do the same things that your friends want to do. And also how this can lead to an intense sense of social isolation and withdrawal from their friends in the outside world. And this social impact of paranoia seems particularly important at this age, which is a sensitive time for social cognitive development. And we know that social interactions at this age play a big part in that development, in shaping our emerging sense of self and how we relate to other people. So we can say that persistent paranoia at this age especially might have a particular impact on longer term social dysfunction that can lead into adulthood. So what our research is showing is that rather than just a symptom of psychosis or indicative of psychosis risk, paranoia seems to be a broader clinical problem in young people that deserves clinical attention in its own right. For some young people, this early expression of paranoia might precede the onset delusions, but for many others it won't do. And for some young people, this paranoia might just form part of their broader clinical picture, existing alongside the other mental health problems that contribute to that overall distress and dysfunction. And we've made good developments in treatments for psychosis in adults by focusing specifically on individual symptoms and understanding the causal mechanisms driving those individual symptoms. Yet this single symptom approach is yet to be applied to early intervention. And actually we need to think, although identifying young people who have emerging risk of psychosis is very important to increase access to services for them, we need to also think about the young people left behind in CAMS, because those young people with psychotic experiences who don't meet criteria for early intervention services. So if the young person has paranoia but it's not psychotic, do we ignore that paranoia? And if we only think about paranoia in the context of extreme persecution delusions, are clinicians even able to recognise paranoia as an important problem in terms of its broader spectrum? So I think that we need to now be actually assessing and treating paranoia within adolescent mental services, not just within EI. And that we need to therefore now work on developing more evidence-based treatments to help young people overcome these fears and feel safer at this important time in their development. Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the people who collaborate with me in this project, in particular the local CAM services and also the young people who take part in my research. So thank you.
Next we have Elizabeth Rapper. She's a researcher in the department, and she focuses on this very fragile moment of when families are given a diagnosis of a life-threatening condition.
Okay, so yes, my name's Elizabeth, and I am part of Alan Stein's group, and I'm going to talk to you today about an area of research that we're focusing on at the moment that you might not be aware of. And Louise Dalton and I have been leading this work recently. And so we're going to talk to you about why this is such an important area of research, and then also provide an example of an intervention that we conducted in South Africa with an HIV-positive cohort of others. So why do we think life-threatening conditions are so important? So we know that there is a huge, high global prevalence. Many adults who are diagnosed with a life-threatening condition are parents themselves, and they're living with children at home. In the USA alone, we know that 2.85 million children are living with a parent who's been diagnosed with cancer. Mina's touched on the fact that we are doing lots of work in low middle income countries, and that the burden of disease is even higher in these settings. 70% of all deaths from cancer occur in LAMICs, and nearly 1 in every 25 adults living with HIV live in LAMICs, with some parts of Southern Africa, over a quarter of pregnant women are HIV positive. So why is communication so important? So as a parent, the thing you want to do most as your role is to protect your children from any form of distress or upset. When a parent is diagnosed with an illness, or even the child themselves, children notice these changes. They notice that their parents may be acting differently, they may be on the telephone, they may be crying, they may be attending clinics and appointments that are different in their normal routine. Children are so observant and they pick up on all these emotional and physical changes. If we don't provide children with any kind of explanation of why these changes are occurring, children just use these observations and they try and make sense of it all on their own. They might feel isolated, scared, even guilty, and they construct their own reality that's often not based on truth, worse than what they can possibly imagine. And in some cases, they actually think that they have done something wrong to cause all these changes that are happening. So we need to make sure that we're giving children, right at the start of these disease journeys, the right information that's age appropriate, of course, but so they can try and make sense of what's happening around them. We know that there is a lot of evidence to show that if we don't, and communication is poor within families, that it has a huge impact on the psychological and physical well-being of themselves, the parents, and the children. So our team led an intervention study in a rural part of South Africa, where we were conducting a study with HIV-positive women. So because now we have so many successful prevention of mother-to-child transmission programs, it means that what's happening is we have a lot of HIV-negative children, but they're living in a household where one of their parents is HIV-positive. So what we wanted to do is help mothers in these situations disclose to their child that they had HIV and compare this, which was called the Amagugu study, and compare this to an enhanced standard of care. So just to say that these children are all HIV negative. So this slide looks a bit complicated and a little bit busy, but a lot of work went into this before we even did the intervention with a pilot and evaluation study to try and make sure that we're targeting the right psychological mechanisms to make a proper change for these parents. So when a mother is infected with HIV, they obviously have fear, distress, they feel isolated, and they experience high levels of stigma. So what they do is they use avoidant coping mechanisms. This then often leads to them not disclosing their HIV status to their child. So if we just concentrate on this middle one, which is what I'm going to explain. So they're not going to talk about HIV to their child. It means that the communication between them and their child is not as great as it used to be. It means that they don't have an opportunity to tell their children what HIV is, how HIV is transmitted, or be able to talk to them about healthy sexual practices. Also, if you're HIV positive, there are chances that you're going to end up in having spent times in clinics and hospitals where you might be unwell. If your child doesn't even know and your family don't know that you're HIV positive, you're not going to put any plans in place to help people look after your children in these situations. And even in your death, if there's nobody there to look after your children. So what the Amagugu study did was we were providing mothers with active coping mechanisms so that they could disclose to their child, that the communication would get better, that they would be able to then talk to their children about safe sexual practices and how HIV is transmitted. And in times when they weren't there, that their children would be looked after. So this not only was having behaviour changes in the parent themselves, it would hopefully have a long-term impact on the children. So the interventions itself was 6 sessions with a lay counsellor. During these sessions, the mother would be helped on what it was like to have a diagnosis of HIV. We would provide her and give her skills on how to anticipate what reactions and behaviours their children might have once they've been told that their mother's HIV positive. It would also identify other people within the family that they could then discuss HIV with. We provided them with activities and some really beautiful materials so that they could easily sit down with their child and explain to them what HIV was and how they'd come to be in this situation. But it was always done in an age-appropriate and a non-stigmatising manner. And just to say that the controls, an enhanced standard of care where the mothers would, at one of their normal clinic visits, actually have a 1-hour counselling session to promote HIV disclosure. So what did we find? So Amagugu, compared to the control, led to an increase in any form of disclosure. So that's partial or full. Partial meaning that the word virus was used, full meaning the word HIV was used, and that more mothers fully disclosed to their child. The time to this disclosure was way shorter in the intervention group. And also, it led to more children being told within the household of their mother's HIV status. If you remember my previous slide when I was showing the middle of what we thought the mechanism was and where the impact would be, it did affect those points along the pathway. It meant that Amagugu led to the mother actually taking the child to the health clinic, discussing a care plan, and also appointing a guardian. It also affected the parent-child relationship, where they had lower scores on the parent-child dysfunctional relationship scale. Both arms actually did show improvements in mental health, family functioning, and parental stress. And we're actually now following up these children. This was done at 9 months. This is now 2 years later, and where the preliminary results show that actually we are having a big long-term effect on these children, which is what we hoped at the beginning. So what's the future? And why are we so passionate about this area? So I think I can say that every person in this room would have had a friend or know of a friend or of a family member who's been affected by a life-threatening condition. Although I've just described to you Amagugu, this is way bigger than just HIV and way bigger than just a cohort in South Africa. This affects everybody, this affects every country, and it transcends all health disciplines. Our team, only last week on Friday, had just published a series in The Lancet reviewing all the evidence. And the most startling thing we found is that there's actually a lack of evidence-based, child-focused guidelines to help all healthcare professionals support families in talking to them about how they talk to their children about a life-threatening condition. We propose within our series a framework of principles that healthcare workers could use to help parents in this incredibly challenging and incredibly emotionally demanding task. We are now trying to make sure that these principles are culturally relevant, they're applicable to all levels of healthcare professionals, not just clinicians, because we know that it's not just clinicians who are doing the diagnosis, the nurses, the lay counsellors. So what we hope, and I hope that I've shown to you how important communication to children is, and that the work we're now doing can actually lead to changes at the health system level.
Wow, that was an important message. So now we're going to go unreal. I've met Dan Freeman already. He's a professor in clinical psychology and NIHR research professor, and he's co-founder of Oxford VR. And he's going to tell us about use of VR in treating psychological conditions.
Thank you. To start with, it's no statements that I got through my clinical training thanks to these two books. So thank you very much to the editors and contributors to these books. Thanks also to Guy Goodwin for letting me in the department, and the people in my research group, whoever has my copy of Science and Practice Therapy, I'll hand it back. Please. Virtuality is here. Or not.
Virtual reality is here, and the demand for PC-based virtual reality says it's time to get into the game.
That's a 1990s promo video for VR, which has been heralded many times, but actually VR is here and it's coming on in leaps and bounds because of companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, a whole raft investing in it. It's already consumer kit, it's already good consumer kit, so in office and psychiatry, these sorts of things can happen. This is Katie, my team, walking the plank. health difficulties are inextricably linked to the environment. Fear of heights, or about being near heights, social phobia, being around other people, PTSD from car accidents, being around roads and traffic, alcohol problems, it's being around alcohol. The best treatment to help people think, feel, behave differently in the situations that trouble them. And with VR, we can take them to those troubling situations. And the advantage is that people know it's not real, it's a simulation, and therefore they can do things they wouldn't in the real world. And of course, we can grade it. But the learning they're making in VR translates to the real world. This has been known for 25 years. With the advances in the tech, what we think we can do is automate the provision of high-quality psychological therapy and make it highly engaging so we can get these very good psychological treatments for many more people. To help do that, a couple of years ago, set up Oxford VR, a spin-out company from the university, to develop a number of automated psychological treatments for mental health disorders. We now have over 30 people working in the company. The first treatment we developed 2 years back now, so even this is a bit dated, is a fear of heights treatment. This is our therapist, Nick.
Take as much time as you like to look around. You'll find there's something happening on every floor, right up to the very top of the building. Not to mention our floating whale, Wilbur. This building has 10 floors. Imagine you're standing on a balcony overlooking the atrium. On which floor do you think you'd experience a moderate level of anxiety?
So on each floor, there's a range of tasks to help a person evaluate their threat cognitions. The trial was published last year, 100 people, on average 30 years of fear of heights. They had the automated treatment over 2 hours. The effects are very good. Average reduction in fear of heights of 68%, effect size of 2. This really works. You can see, I've got many videos of this as one example. This is Richard before therapy. He was asked to go to the balcony there and is struggling to get there. Comes in, does the automated psychological therapy. It's challenging for him. This is after therapy. Not sure.
This would have been simply impossible 3 months ago. But it would have been total avoidance. I wouldn't even have attempted this.
So that's the power of the sorts of treatments that are developed in Oxford and potentially be developed through VR. One of the major projects we're working on now is Game Change. This is an NHR IFRI Challenger Award, and our aim is to transform services to patient psychosis by putting VR into it and producing large clinical benefits, the sorts of changes perhaps we saw from Richard there, but applied to the problems of psychosis. Over a dozen different organisations involved, over a dozen different applicants, many from Oxford are involved. The wider team, here's some of the people, it's growing to about 50 people later this year. So it's a large project, and our clinical target is the anxious social withdrawal that 80 to 90% of patients with psychosis experience. They, maybe because of residual paranoia, of voices, of social anxiety, or depression, when they go into social situations, feel frightened and therefore withdraw and become isolated. And this leads to worsening physical and mental health. So that's our clinical target. We've got a large program. We've been completely designing with patients the treatment, the VR treatment. We do implementation studies looking at barriers and facilitators within the health service of VR. We conduct a large RCT, and we're also looking at rollout nationally and internationally, all the time advised by a lived experience advisory panel, people who've had experience of psychosis. We've worked very closely with the PIN Foundation on this, got a lot of PPI. Just in the first 6 months since June, we've had 16 patient workshops, 4 lead meetings, lots of individual patient meetings, over 500 hours of patient input. The treatment's going to be 6 sessions, 6 scenarios, everyday situations for patients identified as difficult, getting on a bus, being in a pub, being in a cafe, walking down the street. A lot of work developing these flow scripts, detailing precisely what will happen in VR, and of course we have to meet medical device regulations. There's a trial starting in July of over 400 patients with psychosis in 5 centres, including Oxford, and that'll be starting soon. Just a sneak preview of some of the model builds of the treatment. I'm not going to show you any of the treatment, not even avatars, but the basic environments the treatment's going to happen in. This is where the person meets the therapist. It's based upon my room in the Welcome Building, which is very nice. There's going to be a bus. So you can imagine there'll be different grades of severity of this. There'll be more people in it. It's a GP surgery. Patients often find it very difficult to go into them. People will look at you, you have to say something personal. So they're tasked with that. This is our street, and the person will actually start off in a VR flat of their own and go out onto the street. You can see the pub that's going to feature some of the environments and a mini-mart. And this is going to be full with sort of people coming around the corners in cars, so it's going to be some challenging environments for people to really learn that they can cope and nothing bad's going to happen. And this is a very nice cafe. And I'm just going to finish now with a caveat.
Because while being immersed is good, total immersion is what you'll want, probably what you'll crave, and it's legal. You're not supposed to have this much fun, and you won't if you think all VR is created equal.
All VR is not created equal. It's great tech, but the content matters hugely. So in Game Change, what we're doing is taking the best psychological theory, working with patients about how to implement that into therapy, and testing and evaluating it. If we do that, I think we have potential to enable many more people to have the very best psychological treatments. Stop there.
Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that session as much as I've done. I mean, over this morning we've heard, like an amazing, dizzying array and breadth of psychological therapies across many, many different types of conditions across the human lifespan, and in various different kinds of physical, social, digital, and virtual environments. And the bad news is that we're not going to have lunch quite yet. We started a bit late. And the good news is that we will just save 10-15 minutes for questions for any of the speakers across the morning. So we have a little bit of a game here that there are fewer chairs than speakers, and all the speakers come up, including those in the morning. So you want to, yeah? We also need the morning luminaries. Oh, we have someone running away. We have an impersonator for Willem. Do you want to come up, Captain? Okay. So here's the lineup. Who's your criminal? Anyone? Yes. You have a mic coming to you. Keith?
I'd like to ask the panel, shall we call it, what they would say to Michael Gelder now about what he did to produce this wonderful array of people and all the wonderful work we've heard of. I think there's one or two people here who might like to speak particularly to Michael.
Well, say thank you. It's extraordinary what you did. And Michael's appointment was an extraordinary appointment. I mean, he was an expert in psychological treatments coming from the Institute of Psychiatry. And when you come to Oxford and create the first chair, it's obviously natural that you will develop your own area, which is what you did so wonderfully. But what is extraordinary is that you also created such a diverse department and really put psychiatry across the board on the map in Oxford. And I think that was a sort of extraordinary double achievement that Michael made. He was always unbelievably supportive and at the same time very firmly critical. My most positive moment with him was when I finally wrote a sort of renewal of one of my welcome grants, and he always used to cover it with red ink or green ink or something, but he sent the last one back with a yellow sticker on it and just said, I can't improve on this. And I used to hide this little sticker behind the department seminar list for years. But you can just see the extraordinary influence he had on all of us to help us be more rigorous and more effective.
And I don't know another thing, he led from the front, so he always he led from the front, he always sat in the front of all lectures. He was the first to ask a question, it was always difficult. He always taught the medical students. He was always there at research meetings. He was absolutely involved with every aspect of the department. It was admirable. And his breadth of knowledge was extraordinary. He was really on top of the field. In fact, for years later too, he was one of these awkward people when you met 20 years after he'd retired. He'd have read your most recent paper and actually thought about it more than you had. So he was really on the ball.
So what red ink would he put on you? I mean, what is the failure? What's the missing achievement of this amazing breadth of people here?
We're all survivors. He helped. Yeah, he was very lucid.
I have to say, I mean, clearly, thank you would be a big thing. I mean, David and Chris both hinted at the fact that he could be very critical. But it was never personal, and he did not discriminate. So he was, you know, one of the things as being a kind of new member of the department, I came in for my share of criticism, but I also saw, you know, very senior people getting exactly the same criticism, so it did not feel personal, and it felt like he was really trying very hard to actually help people, so it was constructive. So thank you for being constructive, I guess.
Do you have other questions or comments? Hungry people here.
Thank you for all the talks this morning. I had a question. So I think in the morning we heard a lot about the importance of accessibility of the psychological treatments and therapies, making them available to the masses. And the VR treatments, as exciting and remarkable as they are, I wonder how you foresee the scalability of a therapy like this and how it could be incorporated within, are we ready for it to be incorporated within the NHS infrastructure, for example?
Yes, the VR tech already, we're actually taking home visits using clinics, but also for the next couple of years it's going to change enormously. For the moment you need a laptop and a headset and some trackers, but that will all be contained in the headsets that are coming out this year. So the tech in the end, I think, because it's standalone, I think can work. We're working very hard to work out actually what may hinder that, both from the patients and staff and commissioners, but the tech itself, it is coming, and even some of the tech that will be in your phone in the next couple of years will be extraordinarily good. So not worried about that. So that's what I'm sure.
Is there a question? Yes. Yeah, we have a mic coming.
Thanks. What's your level of hope and the possible promising strategies for getting the government to increase the goal beyond the mere 25% of patients to receive treatment? And when do you think we could get to a stage where all patients receive treatment in a timely manner?
Well, I think we are likely to get there. There is a general acceptance of a parity of esteem between physical health and mental health. I think when the government accepted that term, it didn't quite know what it meant. But we have been trying to teach them what it means. And what it means is that you should have the same access to treatment if you have a mental health condition as you have with cancer. So that's the goal. But the problem, of course, is getting there with capacity that really is effective. And it takes time to train a workforce to grow to the capacity you need from a situation where we had such gross under-treatment only a decade ago. And so that's why we've still got a journey to go. But many of the young people here in the room will be on that journey and will help us the other thing I think is for people in rooms like this not to think in a narrow way about their clinical academic interests, because you only really change stuff if you bring in economic arguments and political arguments as well. And we need to become rather more sort of Renaissance type people in matching all of those arguments in one individual.
I'm going to pass it over to Mina for a comment on that as well.
Well, for children, I do think it is a complicated, a harder task, and I think part of that is because in reality there's such a dearth of good research being conducted in child populations, and that the combination of the difficulty of research, the vast majority of research starts from 18 up because it's such a pain to get parental consent and to deal with all these other areas. So actually a lot of the data that we need to kind of transform access and understand about the role of lay professionals, understand the role of environments like schools, get hindered as well because of the research complexities. So I do think kind of good research, good focused research and implementation science kind of agenda within it will also dramatically improve our ability to know what is best to do, because I still think there are question marks there.
Chris wanted to comment and Paul.
I've now moved to working in global mental health, and mainly in India, and in Indian slums and rural India, looking at how you treat depression in that context, which is a serious problem. There's a massive suicide rate. And it is very interesting if you come out of our assumptions about healthcare and just think what treatments can be delivered in that setting, who could deliver them, forget professionals, and just see who can do what. And we're having a remarkable change of people with really quite moderate to severe depressions with simple psychological interventions delivered by people with no qualifications whatsoever, but they're trained for 8 weeks, and that's all they know. They don't know anything else, but they can do that, and they like doing it, and they generally are good at it. So I think we can learn actually from lower and middle income countries where there are limited resources, find alternative solutions, and some of these solutions are relevant to us here.
I agree with what's gone before, but I'm going to also state something which is potentially contentious, which is that one of the best ways to make sure that we get effective treatments to more people is to disinvest from ineffective treatments, and that's a really hard thing to do in psychiatry. To stop offering things which are unhelpful because people do not like their freedom limited. Now, essentially, if there was parity esteem, this is what would happen. You would not be offering outmoded and ineffective treatments. But it's also complicated because if we look at ways of disseminating, such as the use of computer-based programs, or sort of guided self-help type stuff. I know within OCD, for example, the Octet trial recently suggested that it was not effective to offer guided self-help computer-based, and it blocked the care pathway that people then didn't move on. So there are quite complex issues that need to be dealt with this, and the other issue we're going to have to deal with is the issue of money. And one of the issues has got to be huge popularity on things like digital applications. That's great, but there are also issues around conflicts of interest, and almost all of the evaluations compare, say, a digital application with nothing, whereas in fact you should be comparing it, in my view, with a self-help book, because if the self-help book is as good as a digital application, well, it's going to cost a fraction of the amount. So there are really complex issues which I think we're going some way towards dealing with, but we have to, I think, in the end, think about what we don't do as well as what we do.
So does that give you hope or call for arms? Final question or comment? Okay, in the back.
Thank you for some great talks. We heard a lot this morning about how psychological understanding of mechanism is really important to inspire and design new psychological interventions. But I was wondering what the panel's thoughts are on how we can potentially take understanding about who is responding to psychological interventions and maximise our use of that data to potentially work backwards and think about what are the underlying psychological mechanisms that are enabling psychological interventions to work or not to work in some cases, and how that might enable us to sort of refine further and improve interventions in the longer term.
So I see that you're already thinking ahead probably to the next session, but I'm sure our session has something to say about that as well, the role of IAPT.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that has been a key to the Oxford model. So, I think from Chris's trials and Paul's trials and Upton's trials, my trials, what happens is that as we complete the trial, we're obsessed with those people who didn't respond. And we look at them in enormous detail and try and work out what was the target that we didn't manage to change. And often we then do experiments on that target, we do manipulations in the lab until we've got something that will change it. And we often think that's just something we'll add into the program for that small number of non-responders. But we then often find it so potent that it helps everyone. So an example in social anxiety was we had certain types of images people had based on early traumatic experiences. We weren't dealing with them in our normal way, so we took some of our techniques from the PTSD treatment to that small subset of people and only deployed it that way initially. But then in the lab, we thought, well, why don't we try it with everyone? And we found in the lab it worked incredibly well with everyone. So it's now a much more integral part of the program. So I think the key thing is to be obsessed with those people that you don't get better. They're the only interesting ones for the future. And it's also one reason why it is very good that IAPT manages to collect data on everyone. Because if you have missing data, you miss the people you're really interested in, and people who tend not to respond.
So Anka, I wonder if you want to elaborate on that with IAPT going digital, and how does that help address some of these issues as well?
Yes, so with the digital delivery, we obviously have a chance to treat many more patients. So it might be post-traumatic stress disorder. Several people have looked at that question in their trials, like who has a poor response. And it's really not very promising so far because the studies are too small and nothing replicates. So one study finds one predictor and the other doesn't. So we need bigger data sets to really find more reliable moderators that we can study. But I also wanted to say it's probably important not to only look at the patient variables here, because in real life, even the same treatment can be delivered with different levels of fidelity or competency. And one small finding, let's say, from our audit data from, we have 2 data sets of 300 people treated with a PTSD treatment. And we found, for instance, in one predictor was if people had multiple traumas, they had a slightly less good outcome than those that had only like 1 or 2 traumas. But then when we looked at what was actually happening in the treatment, we found actually those people that actually had more traumas got less trauma-focused treatment because the therapist talked to them about many other problems they had in their life, which often comes with so sometimes it's not the patient factor, but actually the implementation of the treatment that is the problem.
Okay, so I think we leave it there. I think it's been a great start for, I'm sure it's going to be a fabulous 2 days, so thanks everyone. Thanks all the students.